In the small, rugged town of Redstone Ridge, tucked in the heart of Western America, Micaela Castillo lived a quiet life, confined to a wheelchair after a past tragedy. But life had a way of reminding her of its darker side. When the Mexican cartel arrived in town, Micaela became their target. They underestimated her, thinking her easy prey. They didn't know that Micaela's bond with her three loyal canines, Rico, Luna, and Max, was something far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. The night they attacked, they didn't realize that the dogs would be their undoing. The brutal fight that followed would send shockwaves through the cartel, bringing its empire to the brink of collapse. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. Redstone Ridge was a town you could almost miss if you blinked while driving through the dusty, desolate highways that cut across the western desert. Few would even know it existed, tucked between jagged mountains and vast stretches of dry land. The town seemed to hold its breath under the harsh sun. For most people, Redstone Ridge wasn't a place they considered to be much of anything. Just a stop for fuel, a brief respite for weary travelers. But for Micaela Castillo, this was home. Micaela had arrived in Redstone Ridge years ago, fleeing from the wreckage of her former life. A promising law enforcement career had been abruptly cut short when a violent attack left her paralyzed from the waist down. She had found refuge in the quiet solitude of this place, surrounded by the raw beauty of the land and the steady, loyal companionship of her 3K9s. Rico, Luna, and Max. They were her family now, and she had learned to live a life of quiet dignity, finding purpose in training and caring for her dogs. They, in turn, had given her a reason to keep going when the pain of her past threatened to consume her. The days in Redstone Ridge were slow, long stretches of silence broken only by the wind or the distant cry of a coyote. It was the perfect life for someone who had suffered as much as Micaela. But that sense of peace, of safety, was about to be shattered. It started with the rumors, whispers in the wind of strange cars showing up at the edge of town, of men with dark eyes and even darker intentions. Micaela hadn't paid much attention at first. The town had its share of characters, and most were harmless. But there was something different about these men, something that set Micaela on edge. She noticed it one evening as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Micaela had just finished her evening walk with her dogs, the quiet sounds of their paws on the dry earth comforting her. As she rolled back into her small, weathered house, she spotted them. Black SUVs parked in the distance, their darkened windows barely visible in the fading light. There was something sinister about the way they sat there, almost as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Her hand instinctively reached for the gun she kept in the drawer beside her bed. She had never wanted to use it, but she also knew that the world had changed, and if the cartel had come to Redstone Ridge, it would only be a matter of time before trouble found her. Micaela's heart quickened as she locked eyes with Max, who was lying by the door, his massive head resting on his paws. The Rottweiler's eyes were alert, his body coiled with tension. Luna and Rico, too, had sensed the change in the air. They were positioned near the window, watching intently. The dogs had an uncanny ability to sense danger, and they were never wrong. Micaela's breath slowed, and she focused on the rising dread in her chest. She knew they were here. The cartel? This was no coincidence. They had come to claim their stake in Redstone Ridge, and Micaela had a feeling that they didn't care who they had to destroy to get what they wanted. Her fingers tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at her dogs. They were her family, her protectors, and as much as she hated the thought of violence, she knew what they were capable of. They could be the difference between life and death. And tonight, she would need them more than ever. The night stretched on as Micaela sat in silence, her mind racing. The cartel's presence had unsettled her, but she wasn't a stranger to danger. She had dealt with criminals before, many of them more ruthless than those who were now encroaching on her home. But there was something about this moment that felt different, something darker, more personal. Max growled low, his deep voice vibrating through the walls. Micaela didn't flinch. She knew what that sound meant. It was the same growl he had given when they first encountered a pack of wild coyotes weeks earlier. It was a warning. "Easy, boy," Micaela whispered. her voice steady despite the adrenaline that coursed through her veins. She reached out to stroke his head, feeling the tension in his muscles. "We'll be ready." As the minutes ticked by, Micaela's mind shifted into a different mode. Training, preparation. The dogs were her lifeline, and they were ready. She had taught them everything they needed to know. The bond between them was unbreakable. In a world that had taken so much from her, they were her strength. From the window, Micaela could see the shadows moving across the street, figures that looked like they belonged to another world, another life. The cartel men were closing in. She had no doubt that they were here to take control, to destroy whatever piece Redstone Ridge had left, and she would not let them. With a steady breath, Micaela wheeled herself toward the door, her heart pounding. She glanced back at her dogs, all of them poised and ready for action. There was no turning back now. Tonight, everything would change. The wind had picked up, rustling through the dry brush outside, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Micaela's heart thudded in her chest, and every muscle in her body was alert, ready for what was coming. The sound of the cartel approaching drew nearer, and she could feel the tension in the air like a physical weight. Her fingers were still wrapped around the gun in the drawer, but her mind wasn't focused on it. No, her attention was on the dogs, her family, her protectors. Rico, the German shepherd, was pacing near the window, his eyes narrowed and his body tense. Luna, the Belgian Malinois, stood at attention beside Micaela's wheelchair, her ears perked up and her tail still. Max, the Rottweiler, was at the door, his massive frame a silent sentinel. In that moment, Micaela knew they weren't just her dogs, they were her soldiers, and in this battle, they would fight with everything they had. Micaela took a deep breath and wheeled herself toward the door. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced them to steady. She had prepared for this, in a way. Over the years, she had learned how to live with the weight of her disability, how to compensate for what she had lost, and how to rely on her K9S when the world felt like it was closing in. But tonight, all her training, all her strength, was going to be put to the ultimate test. As she reached the door, she turned to her dogs. "Stay sharp," she whispered, her voice low but firm. Rico's ears twitched in response, his body coiled and ready for the command. Luna's eyes locked with hers, and Micaela saw the understanding in them. There was no need for words. They knew their mission. Micaela wheeled the door open just a crack, peering into the dark street outside. The SUVs had parked in front of the general store. There were at least a dozen men, all dressed in black, moving with purpose as they surrounded the building. Their presence was heavy, oppressive, like a storm that was about to break. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she watched them. These were the men she had heard about, the ones who had terrorized towns far and wide, who ran drugs and smuggled weapons with no regard for the lives they destroyed. They were ruthless, calculating, and they had set their sights on Redstone Ridge. But Micaela wasn't afraid. She wheeled herself out onto the porch, her dogs flanking her. They were poised, still as statues, but she could feel the energy building in them, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. Micaela's eyes narrowed as she focused on the cartel members. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. This was it, the moment when she would take a stand. The first man stepped into view. He was tall, wearing dark sunglasses despite the fading light. His walk was confident, almost casual, but Micaela saw the gun holstered at his side. He wasn't here to negotiate. This was about intimidation. He had no idea what he was walking into. "Thought we could talk, Senora," the man called, his voice rough and arrogant. "This town belongs to us now. You might want to leave while you still can." Micaela's eyes flicked to the dogs. She saw them, sensing the danger, reacting to the threat. Max's growl reverberated through the still night air, a deep rumble that sent a chill down the man's spine. Rico shifted slightly, and Luna's ears stood at attention, her eyes locked onto the approaching cartel member. The man faltered for a moment, clearly unnerved by the growl. But he recovered quickly, his hand going to the gun at his waist. Micaela's heart raced, but she stayed calm. She knew how to handle herself, how to outsmart her enemies. And tonight, it wouldn't just be her. She didn't wait for him to make the first move. "You picked the wrong town," Micaela said, her voice cold and steady. Before the man could react, she gave the command. Go. Max was the first to spring into action, charging forward like a living freight train. His massive frame blurred as he collided with the cartel member, knocking him off his feet with a force that would have been impossible for any human to survive. The man's gun flew from his hand as Max pinned him to the ground. His powerful jaws locked onto the man's arm, his body a wall of muscle and fury. Rico and Luna moved in perfect harmony, flanking the remaining men. Luna was a blur of motion, darting in and out with lightning speed. She tore into one man's leg, her teeth sinking deep, while Rico went after another, his teeth snapping like a vice as he latched onto the man's arm. The cartel members were scrambling, unprepared for the sheer ferocity of the dogs. Micaela wheeled herself back into the shadows of her porch, out of sight. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she didn't hesitate. Her dogs were already taking care of business. The violence was brutal, but it was quick, efficient, and necessary. The man who had been knocked to the ground by Max struggled to pull himself free, but he wasn't going anywhere. Max's grip tightened, and with a savage jerk, he tore through the man's arm, rendering him useless. The cartel member screamed, his blood staining the dust beneath him. Micaela's eyes narrowed. This was only the beginning. As she turned her gaze back to the rest of the cartel members, she saw chaos unfold. They were panicking, scrambling for weapons, trying to regain control. But it was too late. Her dogs had already taken the fight to them, and the cartel's plans were unraveling in real time. Max released his hold on the man beneath him, his eyes shifting toward the next target. He was a machine, his movements precise and deadly. Luna and Rico were cutting through the cartel like a whirlwind of fury. Micaela's hand tightened around the armrests of her chair, her chest tight with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had never imagined it would come to this, but here she was, fighting back in the only way she knew how. And the cartel would regret ever stepping foot in Redstone Ridge. The wind howled through the empty streets of Redstone Ridge, a harsh, unrelenting force that seemed to carry the stench of blood and the screams of the fallen cartel members. The scene was chaos, flashes of movement, the crack of gunfire, the desperate growls of men trying to defend themselves against the onslaught of Micaela's dogs. But the dogs were unstoppable. Max was still holding one man down, his powerful jaws locked around the cartel member's arm, making it clear that escape was not an option. The man's face contorted in pain, his cries for mercy echoing in the night air, but Max didn't release him. Rico was on another, dragging him to the ground with precision, his teeth sinking deep into the man's side. Luna, graceful and swift, was already on the move, darting between the remaining cartel members, her speed and agility unmatched as she tore into them with a cold efficiency. Micaela's heart raced as she watched from the shadows, her mind still sharp, her focus unbroken by the brutality unfolding before her. The dogs were a force of nature, her force of nature, and they were doing exactly what she had trained them to do. The cartel hadn't expected a fight like this. They hadn't expected her. The last few men were scrambling now, trying to regroup, but there was no escaping the dogs' onslaught. They were trapped, surrounded by the brutal precision of the K9s. Micaela watched as one of the men, a younger one with a look of terror in his eyes, turned and ran. He was fast, but he wasn't faster than Luna. She shot forward like a bullet, her sleek form cutting through the darkness with deadly intent. With a single, swift motion, Luna took him down. Her teeth found his throat, and his screams were cut short. The man collapsed to the ground, motionless. The remaining cartel members froze for a moment, their faces pale with fear as they realized that they had no way out. Micaela's fingers clenched tightly around the wheel of her chair, her breath coming fast as she surveyed the scene. It was happening too quickly. The fight was almost over, but the aftermath was only beginning. She could feel the weight of it settling on her chest, the reality of what had just transpired. The cartel was being decimated, but she didn't feel victorious. She felt a strange emptiness, a lingering tension in the air, as if the battle was just the beginning. As the last cartel member fell to the ground, Rico released his hold on the man's arm and stepped back, his eyes scanning the area for any further threats. Max stood tall, his massive chest heaving with each breath, his sharp gaze locking onto Micaela. Luna, bloodied but unharmed, padded back toward her, her eyes fierce but calm. For a moment, everything was silent. The wind howled again, pushing the blood-stained dust across the street, but it seemed far away, as though the world had paused. Micaela wheeled herself forward, her heart still pounding in her chest. She reached down and patted Max, who leaned into her touch with a soft whine. "Good boy," she murmured, the words coming out hoarse, filled with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. The silence was broken by the distant sound of sirens. The sheriff's office wasn't far from here, and Micaela knew the deputies would be on their way soon. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. The cartel had been here, and now they would never come back. Micaela wheeled herself toward the fallen cartel members. They lay scattered in the street, blood pooling around their bodies, the evidence of their violent intent now a stark contrast to the quiet peace of the town. Her gaze flicked from one lifeless form to another, and though she felt no sympathy, she couldn't deny the weight of the moment. She had fought for this, fought for her survival, fought for Redstone Ridge, fought for the life she had carved out of the dust and the pain. And she had won. But as she took in the destruction around her, she knew that this victory came at a cost. The cartel would not be the only ones to feel the consequences of this night. The town of Redstone Ridge was forever changed, and so was she. The distant wail of the sirens grew louder, drawing closer. Micaela's gaze moved to her dogs, their bodies covered in blood, their fur matted and heavy with the weight of battle. They were exhausted, but they were still standing, still alert. They had given everything to protect her, to protect this town. Micaela took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with the effort. "Let's go home," she whispered to her dogs, her voice rough but steady. There was no time to celebrate. There was only the aftermath. The law would be here soon, and she had to be ready for the questions, for the consequences. As she wheeled herself back toward her house, her dogs following closely behind, Micaela couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was at play here. The cartel's defeat was just the beginning, and she knew that their empire wouldn't fall so easily. There were always consequences, and now she was a part of something far bigger than herself, something that would either break her or make her stronger. But for now, she focused on the quiet of her home. She needed to regroup, to think. The dogs were exhausted, but they would rest. Tomorrow, she would face whatever came next. But tonight, she had one. And that would have to be enough. The night had fallen silent again, save for the distant wail of sirens as the sheriff's department made its way toward the heart of the action. The wind had begun to die down, leaving only the soft rustling of the trees in the distance. But for Micaela, there was no peace to be found in the quiet. As she wheeled herself back toward the safety of her home, the events of the night replayed in her mind. Her heart was still racing, her body still humming with the adrenaline that had surged through her during the fight. But the battle was over. The cartel had been dealt with, for now. And yet, Micaela couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The storm was far from over. Her dogs walked beside her, their steady presence a source of comfort as they made their way back to the house. Max, still on alert, kept his large frame close to Micaela, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the same keen awareness that had saved her life more times than she could count. Luna trotted at her side, her coat bloodied but her movements graceful, like a ghost in the night. Rico, the ever-vigilant German shepherd, paced a few steps ahead, his ears flicking at every sound, every movement in the dark. They were the only family she had left, and tonight, they had been her saviors. Micaela's house loomed in the distance, a humble structure that barely looked like a home at all. The paint was chipped, the roof sagging in places. But it was hers, and it had been the only refuge she had found after the attack that had taken everything from her. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and the dogs filed in ahead of her, their bodies covered in blood and dirt. Micaela winced as she looked at them, her loyal companions, her partners in survival. They had fought with everything they had, and it had cost them. The blood that coated their fur was a reminder of the savagery of the fight, but also of the victory they had claimed. As she wheeled herself inside, She closed the door with a soft click, locking it behind her. The house was quiet now, the chaos outside fading into the distance. But the weight of the night's events pressed heavily on her shoulders. She moved toward the kitchen, where a small sink awaited the task of cleaning her dogs. It was a long process, one that required patience. She grabbed a few towels, her fingers trembling slightly as she unrolled them and set them on the table. Max stood still, his head lowered, sensing her unease. Rico, ever the guardian, lay at the foot of her chair, watching her intently. Luna sat by the window, her head raised, still alert, despite the blood that stained her fur. Micaela took a deep breath and turned her attention to Max first, gently patting his side. "You did good, boy," she murmured, her voice soft with gratitude. Max looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He had been the first to act when the cartel had made their move, his massive form crushing one of the attackers with a force that had been nothing short of brutal. And yet, despite his strength, he was gentle with Micaela, always careful, always protective. She reached for the first towel and began to clean the blood from his fur. It was a slow process, and as she worked, her mind wandered to the events that had led her to this moment. She had been living in Redstone Ridge for years, trying to rebuild her life after the attack that had left her paralyzed. But now, everything had changed. The cartel had come to her town, and they had underestimated her. They had thought that they could intimidate her, that they could take what they wanted without facing any real opposition. But they hadn't counted on her. They hadn't counted on her dogs. And they certainly hadn't counted on the fact that Micaela Castillo wasn't the kind of woman who would roll over and die. As she finished cleaning Max, she moved to Luna. Her Malinois was a sight to behold. Fast, agile, and fierce. She had been the one who had taken down the young cartel member who had tried to flee. Micaela's heart swelled with pride as she patted Luna's head. "You were amazing," she whispered, her fingers gently working through Luna's bloodied coat. Once Luna was cleaned, Micaela turned her attention to Rico. The German Shepherd had been the most methodical, the most strategic in his attack. His calm, calculating demeanor had been the difference between life and death for them all. Micaela took a moment to appreciate the quiet strength of her pack, each of them unique, each of them powerful in their own right. As she finished tending to the dogs, the sound of sirens grew louder, pulling her from her thoughts. The law was coming. The sheriff's department would be here soon, and they would have questions. Micaela wasn't naive enough to think they wouldn't be suspicious of what had happened tonight. 12 cartel members lay dead in the street, and Micaela had no intention of explaining herself to anyone, especially not to law enforcement. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going down without a fight. She had faced enough pain and loss in her life to understand that no one would hand her victory on a silver platter. If she wanted to protect this town, to protect herself, she would have to fight for it, tooth and nail. The sirens were closer now, almost at her doorstep. Micaela's heart began to race again. The calm that had settled over her was fleeting. There was no more time for rest, no more time to prepare. The cartel had tried to destroy her town. But Micaela had turned the tables. Now, the world would know that she wasn't someone to be underestimated. With a final glance at her dogs, Micaela wheeled herself toward the front door. It was time to face the music. She wasn't afraid. She had nothing left to lose. The screeching of sirens grew louder, and Micaela felt her chest tighten as the unmistakable sound of approaching law enforcement filled the air. The battle with the cartel was over, but now came a different kind of fight, one that she hadn't anticipated. The sheriff's department was on its way, and Micaela knew all too well how things would unfold. They would want answers. They would want explanations. But in a town like Redstone Ridge, where justice was a rarity and corruption was often tolerated, she had no intention of being anyone's scapegoat. Micaela wheeled herself toward the window, peering out to see the flashing lights of the sheriff's cars cutting through the night. The officers would be here soon, and the pressure was mounting. Her dogs, Max, Rico, and Luna, stood with her, their presence a silent reminder that they were in this together. But now, it was time for Micaela to take control of the narrative. Her eyes flicked over to the lifeless bodies of the cartel members lying scattered across the street. The scene outside her house was almost surreal, too quiet, too still, in stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. There was blood everywhere, stains marking the street like the aftermath of a nightmare. But for Micaela, this was her reality, and tonight she had to face it head-on. The sirens were right outside now, and Micaela's gaze turned back to the door. She had always believed that in a small town like this, everyone knew everyone else's business. But tonight, that would be a double-edged sword. She knew the sheriff, Sheriff Rayburn. He was a decent man, mostly, but in a town with deep ties to criminal organizations, where corruption was often overlooked, Micaela wasn't sure how far his allegiance to her would extend. Micaela took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She could hear the muffled voices of the officers outside now. She glanced at her dogs once more. They were watching her, waiting for her signal, as always. They had done their part. Now it was her turn. The knock on the door came swiftly, sharp and demanding. It was the kind of knock that signified authority. No doubt Sheriff Rayburn himself at the door. "Miss Castillo," came his voice, rough and steady. "We need to talk." Micaela's fingers gripped the armrests of her wheelchair as she wheeled herself toward the door. She had no intention of making this easy for them. She wasn't going to give them any ammunition to use against her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming her town from the forces that sought to control it, to take everything from her. She swung the door open slowly, meeting Sheriff Rayburn's gaze. He was standing there, his face grim and weary, flanked by two deputies. His expression faltered for only a moment as he took in the sight of her. Her bloodied dog standing beside her, her calm but unwavering demeanor. For a brief second, it was clear that he didn't know what to make of the situation. "Micaela," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "What in the hell happened here?" Micaela didn't flinch. She had been through worse in her life, had faced questions and suspicions far more dangerous than this. She met his gaze, her eyes steely with resolve. "The cartel tried to take over Redstone Ridge tonight," she said quietly, but firmly. "They underestimated me, and they underestimated my dogs." The sheriff looked past her, surveying the scene. His eyes scanned the bodies of the cartel members littering the street, the remnants of a brutal battle. The officers behind him were equally stunned, their eyes darting back and forth between the bodies and Micaela. They had all heard the rumors, but seeing the destruction firsthand was something else entirely. "You're telling me you took them down?" Sheriff Rayburn asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Micaela nodded slowly. "Yes, I did, with the help of my dogs." The sheriff took a step closer, his brow furrowing. "I've seen my share of violence, but this is something else. You're lucky no one else was caught in the crossfire, Micaela. This could have been a massacre." Micaela's jaw clenched, but she didn't let her emotions show. "I didn't ask for this, Rayburn," she said, her voice low but firm. "I didn't ask for them to show up in my town, to bring their bloodshed to my doorstep. But I'm not going to sit by and watch them destroy everything I've worked for." Sheriff Rayburn studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I understand that, Micaela," he said slowly, "but we've got a problem. This town, hell, this whole region, has been under the cartel's thumb for years. They won't take this lying down. They'll be back. And you've made yourself their target." Micaela's eyes flicked to her dogs again, their bodies still bloodied but strong, their postures alert. She could feel the weight of the sheriff's words, but she refused to be intimidated. She had faced worse in her life, and she wasn't about to back down now. "They can try," she said quietly, "but they won't win." Sheriff Rayburn took a long breath, glancing over his shoulder at the two deputies standing behind him. "You're going to need help, Micaela. This is bigger than just you and your dogs. You've stirred something up, and now we've got to deal with the fallout. We need to figure out what comes next, before the cartel decides to make an example out of you." Micaela met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm ready for whatever comes next. But this time, I'll be the one making the rules." Rayburn paused, his lips pressing into a thin line. He had never seen Micaela like this before. The woman in front of him wasn't just a survivor. She was a force to be reckoned with. And the cartel had made a dangerous enemy tonight. "We'll figure this out," Sheriff Rayburn said, his voice quieter now. "But I need you to stay safe, Micaela. For your sake, and for the sake of this town." Micaela nodded, her mind already racing with plans, strategies, and contingencies. The sheriff was right. The cartel would retaliate. But this time, they had made a mistake. They had underestimated the one thing they hadn't counted on, her. "I'll be ready," she said, her voice resolute. As the sheriff and deputies moved away, Micaela closed the door behind them, locking it once more. The air in the house felt thick with the weight of what had just been said. The next chapter of this fight was just beginning. But this time, she wasn't going to be the one who had to run. This time, it was the cartel that would be running. The sound of the sheriff's footsteps grew faint as he and his deputies retreated down the dirt path toward their vehicles. Micaela stood there in the dimly lit entryway, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts, her body still trembling from the adrenaline of the night. Her dogs were settled at her feet, their eyes never leaving her, ever watchful, ever loyal. They had done their part. Now, it was time for her to do hers. The sheriff had left her with a warning. He had acknowledged her strength, but he'd also made it clear that there would be consequences. The cartel wouldn't back down quietly. They would retaliate, mercilessly, and when they did, they would make sure everyone knew that Micaela Castillo had been the one to cost them. They'd burn this town to the ground before they'd let one of their own fall without repercussions. Micaela's thoughts shifted, a new sense of determination flooding her mind. She couldn't afford to back down now. This fight wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from her. The cartel had come to her town to destroy it, to establish their rule. But they hadn't counted on a woman in a wheelchair and her 3 relentless dogs standing between them and their conquest. But the battle wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning, and she knew the coming days would be a test like no other. Her dogs had proven their loyalty and their worth, but they couldn't do it all. She would need to outthink the cartel to prepare for what was coming next. She wheeled herself toward the small table in her living room, the same one where she had planned for this very moment for years. The room was quiet, but the weight of the silence pressed down on her like an anvil. Micaela reached for a map that was spread across the table, an old, weathered map of the region. She traced the routes with her finger, her mind racing with plans and strategies. The cartel had a network of safe houses spread across the area, hidden deep within the mountains and deserts. It wouldn't be easy to track them down, but Micaela was no stranger to difficult odds. As she studied the map, her mind flashed to the faces of the men she had seen lying in the street, dead, their blood still soaking the dust. She couldn't feel sorry for them. They had come here to take her life, her town, and she had fought back. But now, she needed to think ahead. This town was not big enough for 2 warring factions, and the cartel was ruthless. They wouldn't stop until they had destroyed everything in their path. The dogs were restless, pacing at her side, sensing her growing tension. Max came over first, his large, heavy head resting against her lap. She reached down to scratch his ears, the rhythmic motion grounding her as her thoughts continued to churn. "What do you think, boy?" she murmured, looking down at his steady eyes. He responded with a soft grunt, nuzzling her hand. Micaela smiled softly, her fingers tangled in his fur. "Yeah, I know. We'll keep fighting." She could feel the weight of the sheriff's words still hanging in the air. "You've stirred something up." Yes, she had. And now, she would need to finish what she started. Suddenly, the faint sound of tires crunching on the gravel outside pulled her from her thoughts. She didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. She recognized the rumbling engines of the cartel's vehicles. Their patrols were no longer subtle. They were marking their territory. Micaela's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The retaliation had begun. She wheeled herself to the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to peer outside. Her eyes narrowed. There, at the edge of town, 2 dark SUVs had rolled in and stopped. She counted at least 5 men, stepping out of the vehicles, their silhouettes outlined against the orange glow of the streetlights. They were armed, their hands resting casually on the weapons strapped to their sides. Micaela's mind raced. They knew she was here. They knew what she had done. They would come for her next. Max growled low, his muscles tensing. He could sense it too. Luna and Rico took up positions near the door. their bodies stiff with anticipation. It was as if they knew the moment was fast approaching. Micaela wheeled herself back from the window, her eyes flicking to her rifles on the wall. She had spent years perfecting her aim, even from the wheelchair. But she knew that she couldn't rely on brute force alone. The cartel wasn't just a group of thugs. They were a well-organized machine. If she was going to survive this, she needed to think strategically. She reached down and patted Max's head, her voice steady as she spoke. "Stay close, boy. We'll fight smart." She took a deep breath, her fingers grazing the rifle stock. Her pulse quickened, but there was no fear, just a cool, calculating focus. Micaela had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. Her dogs had already proven their loyalty and strength, but she knew it would take more than muscle to win this fight. She needed a plan, one that would leave the cartel not just reeling, but crippled. With a quiet command, she rolled to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The dogs were already positioned behind her, ready to act at her signal. There was no turning back now. The door creaked open slowly. Micaela didn't hesitate as she wheeled herself out onto the porch, her eyes scanning the street for movement. She knew the cartel had no intention of walking away. They would come at her hard, expecting an easy victory. They were about to learn that this wasn't a town that would just roll over. The leader of the cartel, Micaela could see him now, his cold eyes locked onto her, stepped forward. He was tall, dressed in all black, a scowl twisted across his face. The others moved in behind him, their weapons held loosely but ready. "You've made a grave mistake, Senora," the cartel leader called out. His voice was low, almost taunting. "This town belongs to us now. You won't stop us." Micaela didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her eyes steely with resolve. "I've only just begun," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. Without warning, the first shot rang out. But Micaela had already anticipated it. She wasn't just a woman in a wheelchair. She was a warrior. And tonight, the cartel would pay for underestimating her. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the stillness of the night, echoing across the dusty streets of Redstone Ridge. Micaela's heart skipped a beat, but she was already moving. The sound of the bullet slicing through the air was a reminder that the cartel was serious. This wasn't a negotiation. This was war. Her eyes locked onto the cartel leader, standing just at the edge of the street, his posture cocky, as though he were certain the town was already his. But Micaela knew better. She had never been the kind of person to roll over, to back down in the face of danger. The dogs sensed it too, the tension, the simmering violence in the air. And they stood, perfectly still, awaiting her command. Max let out a low growl, his body taut with readiness. Luna's ears pricked up, her muscles coiling. Rico, the ever-vigilant German shepherd, stood just behind Micaela's wheelchair, his gaze never leaving the cartel members. The leader stepped forward again, his hand resting casually on the weapon at his side. "You think you can stop us?" he taunted, his voice thick with mockery. "You're just one woman in a chair. What can you do? We own this town." Micaela's grip on her wheelchair tightened. This man had no idea what he was about to face. "You own nothing," she said quietly, her voice cold and unwavering. "This town has always been mine." And with that, she made her move. Max was the first to react. He lunged forward, a blur of speed and power, and within seconds, he was on one of the cartel members, knocking him to the ground with a deafening crash. The man's gun flew from his hand as Max bit down hard, pinning him beneath his enormous weight. Blood seeped into the dirt as the sound of the struggle intensified. Luna was already moving, darting forward with the speed and agility of a shadow. She tore into another man's side, her jaws clamping around his leg with a sickening snap. The man screamed, trying to pull away, but Luna's grip was unrelenting. Her teeth dug in deeper as she brought him to the ground. Rico, ever the strategist, took a different approach. He circled around, darting toward a man who had foolishly attempted to flank Micaela's position. In an instant, he had his teeth sunk into the man's throat, his grip unyielding as the man struggled in vain to break free. The remaining cartel members were in a panic. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected to be hunted down by 3 of the fiercest dogs in the country. The leader shouted orders, but it was too late. His men were already crumbling, one by one, as Max, Luna, and Rico ripped through their defenses. Micaela's heart was pounding, but her mind was focused, calculating. She knew that the fight wasn't won yet. The cartel would always have more men, more resources. They would never stop coming. But tonight, Redstone Ridge had shown them something they hadn't anticipated. The town would not bow down, not while Micaela and her dogs still had breath in their bodies. The leader's eyes flicked toward the carnage unfolding before him. His face twisted with fury as he drew his own weapon, aiming it directly at Micaela. The gun shook in his hand, but his resolve was clear. He was determined to end this now. Before he could fire, Micaela acted. She didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, she reached for her rifle, positioned on the table inside the house, and swung it up toward the leader. She was already a step ahead. Her dogs had disrupted his forces, and now, it was her turn to strike. The cartel leader's eyes widened as Micaela aimed the rifle directly at him, her fingers tightening on the trigger. She took a deep breath, steadying her aim. Time seemed to slow as she centered on him, her mind narrowing in on the target. "You should have stayed away from Redstone Ridge," she said softly, her voice a razor-sharp whisper. With a single pull of the trigger, the sound of the shot rang out, cutting through the tension in the air. The bullet struck the leader in the chest, sending him stumbling backward with a gasp of pain. He collapsed to the ground, his weapon slipping from his hand as he lay motionless in the dirt. For a brief moment, there was only silence. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Micaela's heart was pounding, but there was no satisfaction in her chest. There was only the bitter taste of survival, the knowledge that the battle was far from over. Her gaze shifted toward the rest of the cartel members. They were scattered now, most of them either incapacitated by the dogs or fleeing into the night. The few who remained standing were disoriented, unsure of what to do next. The tables had turned, and the cartel realized, too late, that they had underestimated the woman in the wheelchair. Max, covered in blood, stepped over to Micaela, his large frame casting a shadow over her as he sat by her side. Luna followed, her body sleek and tense, as if ready for anything. Rico came up next, his fur matted with the remnants of the battle, but his eyes still sharp and alert. Micaela gave them each a nod of gratitude, her breath still heavy from the fight. She knew this victory wouldn't be easy to explain. The sheriff and the deputies would arrive soon, and the questions would start. But she was ready for them. The cartel leader had fallen, but the fight for Redstone Ridge was far from over. Micaela wheeled herself toward the edge of the street, her dogs following closely behind her, the smell of blood and dust heavy in the air. She could feel the weight of the town's future pressing down on her shoulders, but there was one thing she knew for sure. Redstone Ridge was no longer just a town to survive in. It was a place to fight for, and she would fight until her last breath. The sound of retreating footsteps and the low growl of her dogs were the only noises that filled the night air as Micaela surveyed the carnage around her. The streets of Redstone Ridge, which had once been quiet and desolate, were now stained with blood. The lifeless bodies of the cartel members lay scattered across the dirt like discarded marionettes. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, hung heavily over the small town. Micaela's heart was still racing, her chest rising and falling with every breath, but there was no time to relax. She could hear the distant rumble of engines in the distance, the sound of reinforcements arriving, likely a larger force sent to avenge the men who had fallen tonight. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Max, Luna, and Rico were already standing guard, their bodies still, alert, and bloodied but unbowed. Their instincts told them the danger wasn't gone yet. But they also knew that their loyalty to Micaela was unwavering, that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Micaela wheeled herself toward the fallen cartel leader, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of life. She knew that the cartel wouldn't take this defeat lightly. The man she had shot was only one of many, and now there would be more. More people coming for revenge, more bloodshed to follow. She needed to make sure she was ready for it. She needed to prepare. The leader's body lay motionless in the street, his blood seeping into the earth. Micaela's gaze lingered on his form for a moment before she forced herself to look away. The fight was over for him, but for her, it was only just beginning. His death was just the spark. The cartel would not give up easily. She wheeled herself toward the porch where she had left her rifle. The dogs followed her, stepping carefully over the debris, their instincts sharp. Micaela needed to gather her thoughts to plan her next move. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. The cartel had made their move, but they didn't know the depths of the storm they had just stirred. As she reached the porch, the soft thrum of approaching vehicles grew louder, and her heart sank. This was no longer a small skirmish. The cartel was mobilizing. She could feel it in her bones. There would be no more subtlety, no more quiet threats. They would be coming at her full force now. The first of the sheriff's vehicles rounded the corner, and Micaela's heart began to race in anticipation. Sheriff Rayburn and his deputies emerged from their cars, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. They had arrived at the tail end of the battle, and now the town was left in pieces, both physically and emotionally. Rayburn's eyes fell first on the fallen cartel members, then on Micaela, still in her wheelchair, surrounded by her K9S. His face went pale as he took in the scene. "Good Lord, Micaela," Sheriff Rayburn muttered, his voice shaking. "What in the hell happened here?" Micaela didn't answer immediately. She simply sat there, her fingers still gripping the wheel of her chair. Her gaze was cold, focused on the sheriff. She wasn't about to apologize for what had happened. She wasn't about to justify the choices she'd made tonight. She had done what she had to do. The cartel had brought the war to her doorstep, and she wasn't going to back down. "The cartel came here to take over," she said, her voice calm, but tinged with the rawness of the night. "They didn't expect to face resistance. But they're not done yet. And neither am I." Sheriff Rayburn stepped closer, his eyes scanning the bodies, the blood, the devastation. This is insane," he whispered. He looked back at Micaela. "You killed them. You killed all of them." Micaela nodded slowly. "They were here to kill me, to take my town. What else was I supposed to do?" Rayburn looked away, running a hand over his face. "This is a mess, Micaela. There's no way around it. The cartel's going to be furious. They won't stop until you're dead. Until we're all dead. Then we'll fight back," she said firmly. "The cartel thinks they can destroy us. But they don't know what they're up against." Rayburn stared at her, his expression one of disbelief. "You really think you can stop them?" Micaela's gaze hardened, her voice unwavering. "I already have." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. It wasn't arrogance. No, it was the cold truth. She had already fought the cartel and come out on top. But she knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The bloodshed wasn't over. The cartel had power, and they had influence. They wouldn't let one woman and her dogs take them down without retaliation. They would be back, and they would come with everything they had. Rayburn sighed heavily. "I don't know if we can keep fighting them, Micaela. This town, hell, the whole region, is in their pocket. They have people everywhere." Micaela's eyes narrowed. "Then we start taking their people down, one by one. We're not going to sit around and wait for them to come for us. This town belongs to the people who live here, not to the cartel." The sheriff nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. He was a man who had seen violence, who had dealt with criminals and corruption for years. But this was something else entirely. He had never seen anyone stand so firm against the cartel. And while part of him feared for Micaela's life, another part of him couldn't help but respect her resolve. "I'll help you," he said quietly, "but I don't know how much we can do. The cartel's everywhere. They have allies in high places." Micaela looked at him, her eyes sharp. "Then we make our own allies." She turned her gaze to the dogs, who were watching the exchange with an intensity that only they could convey. The fight wasn't over, and Micaela knew that if she was going to survive, if she was going to protect Redstone Ridge, she would need more than just her K9S. She would need an army, and she was going to build it. The weight of Micaela's words hung in the air like a promise, a declaration that would change everything. Sheriff Rayburn watched her with a mixture of awe and fear, his mind racing as the enormity of what she was proposing sank in. She had just declared war on the cartel, and there was no turning back. The path forward would be one of bloodshed, of danger, of uncertainty. But Micaela wasn't concerned with what lay ahead. She had faced her own hell before and survived. Now, it was time to make sure Redstone Ridge did the same. She wheeled herself closer to the sheriff, her hands resting firmly on the armrests of her chair. Max, Luna, and Rico stood beside her, their postures alert, their eyes scanning the surroundings, as if they knew that the next move would be theirs to make. They had been with her through every dark moment, and now they would help her take this fight to the next level. "Rayburn," Micaela said, her voice low but filled with conviction, "we need to rally the people here. We need to get them organized, get them ready to fight." The sheriff looked at her, his brow furrowing. "You really think they'll fight with you? You know how it is around here. Most people are just trying to get by. They won't risk everything for this." Micaela's gaze hardened. "Then we make them understand that if we don't fight now, we'll lose everything. This town, our homes, our lives. The cartel doesn't just want to control us. They want to crush us. And I'm not going to let that happen." Rayburn stood there, silent for a moment, his mind clearly processing the magnitude of her words. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained grim. "I don't know how we're going to pull this off, but if you're serious about this, I'll stand with you." Micaela met his gaze, a fire burning behind her eyes. "We'll start with those who have the guts to stand with us, the ones who aren't afraid to fight back. Then we build from there." As the sheriff turned to go, Micaela felt a sense of urgency settle over her. She knew she didn't have the luxury of time. The cartel would be regrouping soon, and they wouldn't hesitate to come for her again. This time, however, she wouldn't be unprepared. She would fight smarter, harder, and with everything she had. The town was hers to protect, and she would do whatever it took to ensure its survival. The sun had barely risen the next morning, casting long shadows across Redstone Ridge, when Micaela called for a meeting. She had already mapped out her plan, and now it was time to put it into motion. The town was about to become a battleground, and Micaela knew that the first step was to build an army. Word spread quickly. The sheriff had sent word to the few people he trusted, and soon, a group of men and women began to gather in the town hall. Micaela wheeled herself to the front of the room, her K9S standing vigilantly by her side. The people who had arrived looked uncertain, wary of what was being asked of them. They had lived under the shadow of the cartel for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to stand up to them. Now, Micaela was asking them to face that darkness head-on. "Listen up," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "The cartel has made it clear that they want control of Redstone Ridge. They think they can come in here, kill our people, and take whatever they want. They think we're weak, but we're not. We've got something they don't, our will to fight. We've got each other, and we're going to use that to bring them down." The room was quiet, the people shifting in their seats, unsure of what to make of Micaela's words. She could see the hesitation in their eyes, but she wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to sugarcoat it. "This won't be easy," she continued. "The cartel will do everything they can to destroy us. But I promise you this. If we don't fight back now, they will destroy us all. I'm not asking you to do this because it's easy. I'm asking you to do this because it's the only way we survive." The silence in the room deepened, but Micaela didn't wait for them to respond. She didn't have time for hesitation. She had already made her decision. The battle was already underway. "Max, Luna, Rico," she called out. Her K9S stood at attention, their eyes sharp and focused. "They've proven their loyalty to me. Now, I need you to prove your loyalty to each other. I'm not asking anyone here to go into this blindly, but if we want to make sure our families survive, we need to be smart. We need to strike before the cartel has time to regroup." She could see the skepticism in some of their faces. These weren't soldiers. These were people who had lived their lives under the radar, just trying to keep their heads down and survive. Micaela had no illusions about that. She knew that most of them weren't prepared for what was coming, but she had no choice. She couldn't do this alone. "There are no guarantees," Micaela said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "But I can promise you this. I will be with you every step of the way. And if you fight for your town, fight for your families, we'll bring the cartel to its knees." Slowly, one by one, the people began to stand. First, it was a man from the local bar, a veteran who had seen his fair share of violence. Then, a woman who owned the hardware store, followed by others who had lived in Redstone Ridge long enough to know that the town had been suffocating under the cartel's grip. Micaela could feel the momentum building. One by one, they were beginning to believe in what she was offering, a chance, however slim, to take control of their own future. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and now, it was time to watch them grow. "Let's take this town back," Micaela said, her voice rising with the fire of determination. "We'll fight, we'll win, and we'll make sure the cartel knows they picked the wrong place to mess with." And with that, the people of Redstone Ridge, once quiet, once broken, began to rally. The first wave of rebellion had begun. Micaela wheeled herself to the edge of town with a clear, methodical purpose, the newfound resolve of Redstone Ridge at her back. Sheriff Rayburn, who had become an unexpected ally, moved in step with her, his expression a mixture of anxiety and determination. The people who had gathered in the town hall earlier had agreed to fight, and though many were still unsure, Micaela knew that fear was the foundation of the cartel's power. It was time to rip that foundation apart. Max, Luna, and Rico moved alongside her, each of them a steady, lethal force, their bodies taut with energy as they anticipated the coming conflict. The trio of Canines had proven themselves time and time again, but now they would be critical in striking the first blow against the cartel's grip on the town. "Tonight, we send a message," Micaela murmured to Rayburn, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We show them we're not afraid. We're not backing down, and we'll never let them take Redstone Ridge without a fight." Rayburn nodded grimly. He was a man who had seen his fair share of violence in his career as sheriff, but what Micaela was leading them into was something different, something far more dangerous. This wasn't just about protecting a town anymore. It was about destroying a cancerous force that had rotted the region from the inside out. The first of their target points was an old, abandoned warehouse at the edge of Redstone Ridge, one of the cartel's known stash houses. It was an old building with rusted iron gates, half-collapsed windows, and no shortage of dark corners where the cartel could hide their illicit goods. The people who lived near it had long since turned a blind eye to the noise, the strange comings and goings at all hours of the night. But tonight, it would become the battleground where Micaela would make her first stand against the cartel. Micaela wheeled herself to a position behind a pile of crates near the entrance to the warehouse. The people she had gathered, regular townsfolk, were all stationed a few yards behind her, ready to strike. She glanced over her shoulder at them, noting the mix of fear and resolve in their faces. They had chosen to fight, not out of strength or military training, but because they had reached the point where they had nothing left to lose. Micaela raised her hand, signaling to Rayburn. His deputies, spread across the area, were in position, each of them armed with rifles, waiting for her signal to move. The K9s were at the ready, Max, Luna, and Rico, sensing the tension, their bodies taut, prepared to spring into action. She took a steadying breath, focusing on the task ahead. This was it, the first blow. They had no idea how many cartel men were inside, but Micaela knew that the element of surprise was their greatest weapon. If they struck hard, fast, and ruthlessly, they might just have a chance. With a sharp nod to Rayburn, Micaela gave the command. "Go." In an instant, the world erupted. Rayburn's deputies charged, moving quickly and quietly toward the warehouse, their guns drawn. Micaela remained where she was, tucked behind the crates, as she watched the K9s spring into action, their speed and power undeniable. Max led the charge, his muscles rippling beneath his coat as he tore toward the door. Luna and Rico followed closely behind, their eyes locked on the task at hand. The dogs were a blur of motion, in and out of the shadows, their silent precision unmatched. The first of the cartel men, a look of confusion crossing his face, stumbled from the warehouse. He never had a chance to react before Max was on him, slamming into his chest with the force of a freight train. The man went down in an instant, the sound of his body hitting the ground echoing through the night. Inside, chaos erupted. The cartel hadn't expected an attack, especially not one led by a woman in a wheelchair. Their reaction was disorganized at first. Micaela watched through the shadows as more men poured out of the building, guns raised, shouting in Spanish. But it was too late. The deputies, already in position, began firing, taking down 2 men before they even had time to react. Luna was already on the move, darting between the shadows, her speed leaving the men with no chance of escape. She tore through the group with lightning speed, biting down on one man's leg and dragging him to the ground, incapacitating him in a matter of seconds. Rico was the next to strike. He lunged at a man trying to flee into the darkness, his jaws finding the man's throat. The man gurgled in shock, but it was too late. Rico's strength was overwhelming. He pinned the man to the ground, preventing any further resistance. Micaela's heart pounded as she observed the chaos unfolding in front of her. This wasn't just about protecting Redstone Ridge anymore. This was about sending a message that Redstone Ridge would not be cowed by the cartel. They were ready to fight, and they were ready to win. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, the sharp cracks of gunfire blending with the growls of the dogs. But Micaela remained calm. She had planned for this. She had prepared herself and her people for the storm that was coming. And now, the storm was here. Max, having incapacitated the first man, stood tall, his gaze sharp as he scanned the area for the next threat. Micaela signaled to him, and he immediately sprang into action, heading toward another group of cartel members who were trying to regroup inside the warehouse. The remaining cartel men, now thoroughly outnumbered and outmaneuvered, began to scatter. They had come for a fight, but now they were facing the fury of a town that had been pushed to its breaking point. The people of Redstone Ridge were fighting for their lives, their homes, their very future. The cartel had underestimated them, and now they would pay the price. Micaela could hear the distant sound of sirens approaching. The sheriff's deputies were making quick work of the remaining cartel members, ensuring that there would be no survivors to regroup and retaliate. But even as she felt the tension in the air begin to dissipate, she knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. As the last of the cartel men were rounded up and disarmed, Micaela wheeled herself toward the center of the warehouse. Her dogs, still on alert, stood by her side as she surveyed the carnage. It wasn't the victory she had hoped for. There was too much blood, too much destruction, but there was no denying it. The cartel had lost this round. "We've sent our message," Micaela whispered, her voice steady, though her heart was still racing. "But the war's not over. It's only just begun." And as the people of Redstone Ridge began to gather, they knew it too. The battle had been won, but the real fight was still ahead. The first strike had been swift, calculated, and victorious. The streets of Redstone Ridge were now littered with the remnants of the cartel's forces, the bodies of men who had come to seize control and had instead been defeated by a town that had refused to bend. But Micaela knew that the victory had only delayed the inevitable. The cartel was far from defeated, and they would not take this loss lying down. Micaela sat in her wheelchair, her gaze still sharp despite the exhaustion beginning to creep in. The people who had stood by her during the attack were now gathering in the town square, their expressions a mixture of relief, fear, and resolve. They had won the first battle, but they all knew that the real war was just beginning. The cartel wouldn't forget this defeat. They would regroup, and they would come for Redstone Ridge with everything they had. Rayburn had already sent the deputies to search the area, making sure that no other cartel members were lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. But Micaela knew that the cartel had spies everywhere. There were always people in towns like this who would sell out to the highest bidder, and the cartel was more than willing to pay. "Micaela," Rayburn said, his voice steady but edged with concern as he approached her. "We've got to move fast. We've made our stand, but they'll come for us. It's not going to take them long to regroup. We need to figure out where they're going to hit next." Micaela turned her gaze to the sheriff. He was right. She had already been thinking ahead, already preparing for what was coming. They had the element of surprise on their side, but that wouldn't last forever. The cartel wasn't stupid. They would learn from their mistakes. And when they came back, they would come back with a vengeance. "I know," Micaela replied, her voice low but resolute. "But we've done something they didn't expect. We've shown them that we won't back down. And we're not done yet." Rayburn nodded, though his expression remained grim. "You're right. but we need to keep the people safe. We've lost too many already. If they hit the town directly, we'll have no chance of holding them off." Micaela glanced over at the group of people who had fought with her. They were huddled together, talking quietly, trying to process what had just happened. They were brave, yes, but they were civilians. They had no experience with this kind of warfare. And now, they were about to be thrust into a fight that most of them had never imagined. "We won't hold them off by hiding in the shadows," Micaela said, her voice cold and sure. "We're going to take the fight to them. We've got to strike before they have a chance to regroup." Rayburn looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "And where do we strike? Where do we hit them before they can hit us?" Micaela thought for a moment, her mind racing. The cartel had several strongholds in the region: safe houses, warehouses, hidden routes. But there was one place she knew they would have to go, one place where they would regroup. Their central base of operations? It was a compound in the hills just outside of town, a heavily fortified place where the cartel stored weapons, drugs, and money. "North," Micaela said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We hit them where it hurts. We go after their supply routes. We take out their compound." Rayburn looked at her in disbelief, his brow furrowing. "You're talking about going after their main base? You realize how dangerous that is, don't you? It's heavily guarded. You'll be walking into a death trap." "I know," Micaela replied, her expression steely, "but we don't have a choice. If we let them regroup, if we let them build their strength again, we'll be finished. We hit them now, while they're still reeling. If we take their base, we cripple them." Rayburn hesitated, but only for a moment. He had been around long enough to know that Micaela wasn't the type of person to back down from a fight. And in the end, he knew she was right. They couldn't just sit around waiting for the cartel to make the first move. They had to strike while they had the advantage. "All right," he said, his voice low and resigned. "We'll do it your way, but we'll need more help. We can't do this alone." Micaela nodded. She had already been thinking about that. She knew that the people of Redstone Ridge, while brave, weren't enough to take down the cartel's fortified base. She would need to expand their forces, and she knew exactly where to start. Later that day, Micaela gathered the most trusted members of the town, those who had fought with her, and made her plans clear. The town of Redstone Ridge was no longer just a quiet speck on the map. It was a battlefield. She needed everyone to understand the gravity of the situation. The cartel would come for them again, and this time, they wouldn't stop until they had wiped Redstone Ridge off the map. She spoke to the gathered crowd, her voice strong, her words carrying the weight of what was to come. "We've just struck a blow to the cartel," she said, pausing to make sure the gravity of her words settled into their minds. "But we can't rest on our laurels. If we wait for them to come to us, we'll lose. It's time we go to them. We're going to take out their central base, hit their supply lines, and cripple them." Some of the townsfolk looked nervous, unsure of what to make of Micaela's plan. They had fought with her the night before, but they had no idea what they were up against. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a war that could cost them everything. Micaela's eyes swept over the crowd, pausing on the faces of the people who had rallied behind her. She knew they were scared, but they were also tired. Tired of living under the cartel's thumb, tired of watching their town be destroyed, tired of running. It was time to stop running. "If you want to live," she said firmly, "if you want to keep your family safe, we fight. We fight, and we take back what's ours. This is our home, and we will not let them have it." The people nodded, their expressions resolute. The time for hesitation was over. It was time to take the fight to the cartel. That night, Micaela and her newfound allies began their journey north, toward the cartel's compound. The battle was far from over, but the fire in Micaela's heart burned brighter than ever. Redstone Ridge was hers to protect, and she wasn't going to let the cartel take it without a fight. The moon hung low over the horizon, casting an eerie light over the barren landscape. The air was thick with the scent of desert dust, and the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath tires as Micaela, Rayburn, and their small army of townsfolk made their way north, toward the cartel's compound. The journey had taken them through rough terrain, and Micaela's heart beat with an unrelenting rhythm, not from fear, but from the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. She had led them this far, but the real battle was still ahead. Her dogs, Max, Luna, and Rico, were at her side, as loyal as ever, their movements silent and deadly. They had become an inseparable part of her plan, and tonight, they would play a crucial role in bringing the cartel to its knees. The people who had joined her, townsfolk who had once cowered under the cartel's shadow, now marched beside her with a sense of purpose. They weren't soldiers, but they had become something more in the days since the cartel's first attack. They had become a resistance, a force that refused to bend. Micaela wheeled herself toward the front of the group, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. She knew they were getting close to the compound. The closer they got, the more her nerves tightened. She had planned for this moment, but now that it was upon her, doubt crept in. The cartel's base was a fortress, heavily guarded, with armed sentries stationed at every entrance. Even now, they had no idea how many cartel men remained, or what kind of firepower they would face once inside. "Micaela," Rayburn called, his voice low, his face set with determination. "We're about a mile out. You sure you're ready for this?" Micaela didn't answer right away. Her gaze stayed focused on the compound in the distance, just visible against the darkening sky. She could see the faint outlines of vehicles, the silhouette of a guard tower. This was it, the cartel's last stronghold in the region. If they could take it out, they would cripple the cartel's entire operation. But if they failed, it could mean the end of Redstone Ridge. "We don't have a choice," Micaela said finally, her voice steady. "We hit them hard, fast, and we don't give them time to react. We take down their communications, their supply lines, and if we get the chance, we take down their leader." Rayburn nodded, his face grim. "We've got the element of surprise on our side, but we can't afford to hesitate. We go in, hit them, and get out. No heroics." Micaela nodded. She knew the risks. The cartel was ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to wipe out anyone who stood in their way. But she also knew that this was their best chance, perhaps their only chance. "We hit the north side," she instructed, turning her attention to the townsfolk who had gathered behind her. "That's where the weakest point is. Once we're in, we'll spread out. Keep your heads down. No one gets separated." Max's ears twitched as he sensed her growing tension. She patted his head gently, her heart swelling with pride. He had been with her through so much, and tonight, he would prove once again that they were unstoppable together. The small group moved in stealth, their shadows merging with the darkness as they neared the compound. The faint sounds of voices, the crackle of radios, and the distant hum of a generator signaled that the cartel was still active, still alert. The clock was ticking. As they approached the outer perimeter of the compound, Micaela and Rayburn gave the signal to halt. The last thing they needed was to alert the cartel to their presence before they were ready to strike. Micaela wheeled herself into a shadowed alcove, the others huddling behind her. The dogs crouched low, their bodies tense, their senses on high alert. Luna's eyes glinted in the darkness, while Max and Rico positioned themselves as if they had already calculated their moves. They were ready. 5 minutes, Micaela whispered to Rayburn. "We need to be in and out fast." Rayburn nodded, motioning for the group to move forward. They were close now. Micaela's heart beat faster, but she focused on her breathing, steadying herself. She couldn't afford to falter, not now. They crept along the wall, staying low, the sound of their footsteps drowned out by the wind. As they neared the entrance, Micaela could see the sentries standing guard, weapons slung across their backs, talking amongst themselves. They didn't have much time. Micaela gave a quick nod to Rayburn, signaling that it was time to move. Without hesitation, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device that would disable the compound's security system, one of the key pieces of Micaela's plan. The moment the system went down, the cartel would be blind, vulnerable. That was their opening. Rayburn flipped the switch, and the faint hum of the security system cut off. Silence. The sentries immediately tensed, their heads swiveling toward the direction of the disturbance. They hadn't realized what had happened. It was time to move. Micaela wheeled herself forward, her dogs at her side, each of them taking their positions. Max, the largest of the three, was the first to charge. He lunged at the nearest guard, knocking him to the ground with a brutal force that sent shockwaves through the air. The guard barely had time to react before Max's powerful jaws sank into his arm, incapacitating him instantly. Luna was next, darting into the shadows to take down another guard with a speed that left him no time to scream. Rico followed suit, tackling a third guard to the ground with a strength that was almost inhuman. The rest of the group surged forward, deputies moving in to neutralize the remaining cartel members. The compound, once a fortress, was now under attack. The element of surprise was on their side. Micaela's heart raced as she wheeled herself deeper into the compound, keeping a steady hand on her rifle as she scanned the area for threats. "Clear the east wing," Micaela called out to Rayburn. "We've got to take out their communications first." Rayburn nodded, signaling to the townsfolk to follow him. They split off into smaller groups, each tasked with a specific target. Micaela focused on the main building, her eyes trained on the entrance. The dogs moved like shadows, their keen senses guiding them as they took down any remaining cartel members who dared to stand in their way. The fight was quick, brutal, and chaotic. Gunfire rang out, the air thick with the acrid scent of explosives. But the cartel was disorganized now, their control slipping with every passing minute. Micaela's plan was working. They were breaking through. "Got it." Rayburn's voice crackled through the radio, filled with triumph. "Their comms are down. They can't call for backup." Micaela smiled grimly. That was one major advantage gone. But they weren't out of the woods yet. They still had to find the cartel's leader and take him down, once and for all. She wheeled herself into the center of the compound, Max, Luna, and Rico moving ahead, their eyes locked on their prey. The final confrontation was close, and Micaela was prepared to see it through to the end. The cartel had made the mistake of underestimating her before, and now they would pay for it. But as Micaela and her team neared the compound's heart, a new sound filled the air, one that made her blood run cold. The sound of an approaching convoy. The cartel wasn't done yet. The sound of the approaching convoy shattered the brief silence that had settled over the compound. Micaela's heart thudded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. The cartel was coming for them, and they would not give up without a fight. She had anticipated their reaction, but the timing was worse than she had expected. The element of surprise had been their greatest weapon, and now it was slipping away. "We've got company," Rayburn shouted, his voice sharp as he scanned the horizon for signs of the approaching vehicles. Micaela wheeled herself into the cover of a nearby wall, her eyes darting around the compound. Max, Luna, and Rico stood poised at the ready, their bodies low, sensing the shift in the air. The fight was far from over. If anything, it had just escalated. The convoy of cartel vehicles, 3 black SUVs and a heavily armored truck, was barreling down the dirt road toward the compound. Their headlights cut through the night, illuminating the chaos that had already erupted. The vehicles weren't alone. From the back of the truck, armed men began to pour out, their weapons raised, ready to engage. Micaela's mind raced. They had to act fast. If the cartel reinforced their position, they would be overrun in no time. She had to take control of the situation before it got out of hand. "Rayburn," Micaela called out, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "We need to hold them off. Get to the north gate. We've got to slow them down." Rayburn nodded, his face a mask of determination. "You heard her, men. Move out." He and his deputies immediately broke off, running toward the north side of the compound, where the incoming convoy would attempt to breach the gates. Micaela's group wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the very future of Redstone Ridge. Max, Luna, and Rico moved swiftly behind them, taking positions along the perimeter of the compound. The dogs knew what had to be done. Their loyalty to Micaela and the townspeople was unquestionable, and tonight, they would stand as sentinels against the cartel's wrath. Micaela's pulse quickened as the first of the cartel's men reached the gates, guns raised, their eyes scanning for signs of resistance. She didn't hesitate. "Go," she shouted. Max was the first to move, his powerful legs propelling him into action with a speed that was almost supernatural. He lunged at the first man, knocking him to the ground before the man had a chance to raise his weapon. Max's teeth sank into the man's arm, rendering him helpless as the dog pinned him to the ground. Luna and Rico followed quickly behind, moving with surgical precision. Luna darted between the shadows, taking down one cartel member with a swift strike to his leg, while Rico charged at another, tackling him to the ground with a force that left no room for escape. The remaining cartel soldiers hesitated, realizing too late that the fight was already underway. But it wasn't just the dogs who had made their move. The townsfolk, armed with whatever they could find, began firing from behind cover, adding to the chaos. Micaela, though still in her wheelchair, was a force to be reckoned with. She steadied her rifle, her aim steady as she fired on the remaining cartel members, taking them down one by one. Every shot was precise, every move calculated. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her town, for the people who had placed their trust in her. "Keep pushing," Micaela shouted to her team, her voice booming across the compound. "Don't let them regroup." Rayburn's deputies were positioned along the north gate, taking cover behind the crumbling stone walls. They had a clear line of sight to the incoming convoy, but the armored truck posed a significant threat. The soldiers piled out of it with military precision, and Micaela could see that the cartel was preparing to make a stand. "Rayburn, we need to take that truck down," Micaela called, her eyes never leaving the action. Rayburn's voice crackled over the comms. "I've got a few men moving into position. Hold tight, Micaela." The town had already taken its first steps toward freedom, but this was a different kind of battle. The armored truck was the cartel's last card, and they would use it to crush whatever remained of the resistance. But Micaela wouldn't let that happen. In the chaos of the battle, Micaela's eyes locked on the truck. She could see the men inside, armed and waiting to deploy, ready to launch an assault. They had underestimated her once, and now they were about to face their greatest mistake. "Luna," Micaela whispered, her voice low but clear. "Go." Luna, as if hearing the command in her voice, shot forward with blinding speed, weaving between obstacles and shadows, making her way directly toward the truck. The cartel men didn't see her coming until it was too late. Luna launched herself at the nearest guard, sinking her teeth into his throat with deadly precision, taking him out before he could raise his weapon. The remaining guards scrambled, but they were too disorganized, too shocked by the ferocity of the attack. Luna's swift movements and deadly accuracy were a sight to behold. Max and Rico moved in to finish the job, tearing through the ranks of the cartel soldiers with brutal efficiency. Micaela's heart was pounding, but she kept her focus. Her dogs were the key to taking down the cartel's final line of defense. They were her soldiers, and they were performing flawlessly. As the cartel forces continued to fall back, the armored truck was no longer the threat it once was. Micaela's team was pushing them back, and the momentum had shifted in their favor. The compound, once a symbol of the cartel's dominance, was now a battleground for survival, a place where the people of Redstone Ridge were fighting back and reclaiming their home. But Micaela knew this wouldn't be the end. The cartel was far-reaching, and their retaliation would come. They wouldn't give up this easily. But tonight, the tide had turned. Tonight, Redstone Ridge had struck a blow that would send ripples through the cartel's entire operation. As the last of the cartel soldiers were disarmed and taken down, Micaela wheeled herself to the center of the compound, her heart still racing, her breath heavy. Max, Luna, and Rico stood at her side, their bodies covered in blood but their eyes sharp and unbroken. "Is everyone all right?" Micaela called, her voice carrying across the compound. Rayburn approached, his face bloodied but victorious. "We've won, Micaela. The compound's secure, but we've still got work to do." "This isn't over." Micaela nodded, her resolve hardening. "It won't be. But tonight, Redstone Ridge showed the cartel that we're not afraid. We fight for this town, and they would keep fighting, until the cartel was nothing more than a memory." The morning after the battle felt like a long, tense exhale. The streets of Redstone Ridge, once quiet under the shadow of the cartel's presence, were now eerily still. The town had faced the first wave of the cartel's wrath and had come out victorious, at least for now. The compound, the heart of their operation, had been decimated. The convoy had been stopped, the soldiers scattered, their leader captured. Micaela sat in her wheelchair at the center of the town square, looking over the aftermath. The townspeople had gathered, a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief in their eyes. Some were tending to the wounded, others were helping to clean up the debris left behind by the skirmishes. The blood of the cartel soldiers stained the dirt, a grim reminder of the cost of their victory. Rayburn approached, his face weathered but relieved. "It's done," he said, pausing beside Micaela. "The town's secure for now, but we both know this isn't over. The cartel will come for us again." Micaela nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the people around her. They were doing what they could to rebuild, to regain some semblance of normalcy. But Micaela knew that peace would not come easily. The cartel was too entrenched, too ruthless to simply accept defeat. "We've struck a blow," Micaela said, her voice steady, though the weight of the moment was not lost on her. "But the cartel will retaliate, and next time, they'll be better prepared. We can't afford to wait for them to make the next move. We need to hit them first. We need to finish what we started." Rayburn exhaled, looking out at the town. "You're right, but we don't have enough manpower for a full-scale war. The people who've joined us, they're brave, but they're not soldiers. And the cartel, they've got resources. They've got money. They've got connections." Micaela's eyes hardened, her resolve never wavering. "Then we use their weaknesses against them. We take down their supply chains, their money. We cripple their ability to operate in this region. If we can hit them where it hurts, we can force them to retreat." Rayburn regarded her silently for a moment before nodding. "I'm with you, Micaela, but this will take more than just us. We need to gather support outside of Redstone Ridge. We need allies, people who can help us take down the cartel once and for all." Micaela felt a flicker of hope. Allies. The thought hadn't crossed her mind until now. The town was small, its resources stretched thin, but there were people out there. Others who had been hurt by the cartel, others who had their own reasons for wanting to see the cartel destroyed. If they could find them, if they could form an alliance strong enough to challenge the cartel's hold, then maybe, just maybe, they could take this fight to the next level. She looked at Rayburn, her gaze sharp and determined. "We'll start small. We'll reach out to the towns around us, those who've been affected by the cartel's presence. We'll build our network, gather the intel, and then we strike again." Rayburn gave a brief nod. "I'll get the word out. We've got contacts. Some of them may not like us, but they'll understand that the cartel is the enemy. They'll want to help." Micaela's gaze swept over the town once more, taking in the faces of the people who had stood by her, those who had fought and bled for Redstone Ridge. They were tired, yes, but they had shown strength. They had shown that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they would fight back. "Tell the others to keep their heads down for now," Micaela said, her voice carrying the weight of authority that had been born in the heat of battle. "We've won this round, but the cartel will regroup. And when they do, we'll be ready." Later that evening, Micaela stood on the porch of the small house she had made her home. The sun was beginning to set, casting a deep orange glow over the valley. The air was still, the tension of the day finally giving way to a temporary peace. But Micaela knew that peace would be fleeting. The cartel was a beast that wouldn't be easily slain, and their retaliation would be swift. Max, Luna, and Rico stood beside her, their bodies still, their eyes scanning the horizon. Micaela reached down and stroked Max's head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. She had come to depend on these dogs more than she could ever explain. They were more than just her companions. They were her warriors, her family. "Tomorrow, we start reaching out," Micaela murmured, her voice low, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "We find our allies. We build our network. And then we finish this." Behind her, she could hear the sound of the town settling down, the muffled voices of the townsfolk calling to one another, the clinking of tools as people repaired homes and buildings damaged in the battle. There was a sense of hope in the air, a quiet promise that things would get better. But Micaela knew that the true test was yet to come. "Are you ready, boy?" she asked Max, her voice filled with quiet determination. Max looked up at her, his eyes steady and calm, as if he understood exactly what was at stake. Luna and Rico, too, stood with the same silent understanding. The time for hesitation had passed. There would be no more running. Tomorrow, the real fight began. The next morning, Micaela, Rayburn, and a few trusted members of the town set out for the neighboring towns. Word had to be spread. Redstone Ridge was no longer a town that lived in fear. It was a town that would fight, no matter the cost. It was time to take the battle to the cartel's doorstep. But even as Micaela set her plan into motion, a new shadow loomed over her, one she had not anticipated. From the outskirts of town, a single black SUV drove toward Redstone Ridge, its tinted windows obscuring the face of the person inside. The cartel was coming, and they weren't coming alone. The black SUV rolled slowly toward Redstone Ridge as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the town. Micaela's instincts immediately flared, her senses heightened as she felt a shift in the air. The battle they'd won just days before now felt like a distant memory, a brief reprieve before the real storm hit. As the vehicle approached, Micaela couldn't shake the sense of unease creeping through her. They had struck a blow to the cartel, but that had only made them angrier, more determined to destroy her town. Her town. The thought filled her with a sense of duty that overshadowed any fear. Max, Luna, and Rico were beside her, standing at the ready as always. Her 3 loyal K9s seemed to sense the same thing she did. They were alert, eyes scanning the street ahead, muscles coiled like springs. Rayburn, who had been coordinating efforts to form alliances with neighboring towns, approached from behind. His face was drawn, his eyes narrowed as he watched the approaching vehicle. "Micaela, what's going on?" he asked, his voice low, filled with concern. "I don't know yet," Micaela replied, her gaze fixed on the SUV. "But I have a bad feeling about this." She wheeled herself toward the edge of the street, her mind working through all the possibilities. The cartel was known for using intimidation tactics, sending people to do their dirty work without a hint of hesitation. They didn't need to make a grand show. They were already powerful enough. But what did they want with Redstone Ridge now? Had they come to negotiate, to threaten? Or was this the final act of retaliation? The SUV slowed as it neared the town's center, coming to a stop just a few feet away from Micaela. The engine hummed quietly, almost too quietly, and for a moment, there was only silence. No one moved. No one spoke. It felt like the world had paused. Then, the door opened. A man stepped out, tall, well-dressed, and far too confident for Micaela's liking. His sharp features were set in a hard line, and his cold eyes scanned the town with disdain. He wasn't just a foot soldier for the cartel. This was someone who held power, someone with influence. Micaela didn't flinch. She stared directly at him, unblinking. He hadn't come here to talk peace, that much was clear. And the fact that he was walking into Redstone Ridge without a care for the danger made it clear that the cartel had something more dangerous planned. The man spoke first, his voice smooth, controlled. "Micaela Castillo, I presume?" he asked, his eyes narrowing on her. "That's me," she replied evenly. "And you are?" The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "I'm Eduardo Alvarez. You've been quite a nuisance to my operation here in Redstone Ridge." The name hit her like a slap in the face. Eduardo Alvarez. The name carried weight in the cartel. He was a key player in the cartel's distribution network. She had heard whispers of him, stories of his ruthlessness and the fear he instilled in people. Alvarez wasn't just a cartel enforcer. He was one of their masterminds, and if he was here, it meant the cartel was escalating things. "I'm not here to negotiate," Alvarez continued, taking a slow step toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm here to offer you one last chance. Leave Redstone Ridge. Leave now. If you do, I'll let you go. If you don't, well, I'm afraid it will get much uglier for you and everyone in this town." Micaela felt a spark of fury ignite inside her, but she kept her expression steady. She didn't have the luxury of showing weakness. Not now. "I don't negotiate with criminals," Micaela said firmly. "And I'm not leaving. Not now, not ever." Alvarez's smile grew wider, but there was no humor in it. "That's a shame," he said, his tone dark and cold. "I was hoping you would be smarter than this. You've made things personal, Micaela. And when you make things personal with the cartel, we always make sure the price is paid." Micaela's mind raced. This wasn't a simple threat. Alvarez had come here for one reason: to show her just how far the cartel would go. He was telling her, no, warning her, that they were done playing games. But she wasn't backing down. She never would. The tension in the air thickened. The people of Redstone Ridge had gathered, standing on their porches, in the streets, watching. This was the moment when everything would change. Alvarez took a step back, as if savoring the moment. "I'll be back," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "And next time, there won't be a second chance. You and your dogs. You'll regret ever crossing us." With a final, chilling glance, Alvarez turned and climbed back into the SUV. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped away, leaving the dust of the town in its wake. Micaela's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't move. She didn't let her eyes leave the road, not until the SUV had disappeared from view. Rayburn stepped up beside her, his voice a mixture of caution and disbelief. "That man, he wasn't here to talk, Micaela. He's a problem. He's a big problem." Micaela didn't answer right away. She was already formulating a plan in her mind, assessing their resources, figuring out their next move. She had expected the cartel to retaliate, but this was personal, and she was ready. "The cartel thought they could crush us with fear," Micaela said finally, her voice cold. "But they've made a mistake. We're not afraid. Not anymore. And we're not backing down." Rayburn nodded slowly. "Then what's our next move?" Micaela looked over at the townsfolk, their faces filled with concern and fear. But they were still standing tall. They had seen the cost of resisting, and they had chosen to fight anyway. "We get ready," Micaela said, her voice resolute. "This isn't over. We strike back now, before they can strike us again. But we do it smart. We need more allies, more firepower, and we need to hit them where it hurts." She looked at her dogs, standing beside her like sentinels, and smiled grimly. "It's time to take the fight to them, Rayburn. We're going to take everything they have, until they're the ones who regret crossing us." Rayburn didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." And with that, the gears of their resistance began to turn faster. The cartel had made their move. Now, it was time for Redstone Ridge to make theirs. The air in Redstone Ridge was heavy with anticipation as Micaela wheeled herself into the town hall, where the town's makeshift war council had gathered. The previous night's exchange with Eduardo Alvarez had made one thing crystal clear. The cartel wasn't going to stop. If anything, their resolve had only hardened. They were coming for Redstone Ridge, and Micaela knew they needed to act before they were completely overwhelmed. Rayburn was already there, his deputies at his side, eyes scanning a makeshift map spread across the table. The room was filled with the few who had volunteered to fight, the civilians who had already risked everything. It wasn't a large group, but the fight in their eyes spoke volumes. They were ready. Micaela took a moment, watching her townspeople, and then focused on the task ahead. The adrenaline from Alvarez's visit still hung thick in her chest, fueling her every thought. But there was no room for fear. Not now. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking the fight to the cartel. "We have a limited window," Micaela said, her voice cutting through the quiet chatter in the room. "The cartel knows we're coming for them, but if we hit them hard enough, we can cripple their operations. I don't just want to scare them off. I want to make sure they never want to come back." Rayburn gave a short nod, clearly agreeing. "We've been gathering intel, but we still don't know where their supply routes are. They've got connections in nearly every town nearby. If we can hit those routes, it'll cause enough disruption to weaken their grip on the region. We need to find out where their shipments come in." Micaela nodded. This was the crucial next step. If they could intercept the cartel supplies, whether it be weapons, drugs, or money, they could starve them of the resources they needed to keep up their operations. But finding those routes wouldn't be easy. The cartel was good at hiding their tracks. "We have a lead on one of their distribution points to the west," Rayburn said, pointing to the map. "It's a small warehouse near the old mines. It's isolated, but it's an ideal target." Micaela leaned in, her fingers running over the map, considering the strategic implications. "It's close enough to the main roads, but far enough out that they probably think no one would dare strike. We take it down, and they'll know we're serious. It'll send a message." Rayburn raised an eyebrow. "And if we're wrong?" "We don't have the luxury of waiting to be certain," Micaela replied firmly. "The longer we wait, the stronger they get. We go in fast, hit hard, and get out before they can retaliate. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the gravity of the plan. This wasn't just a raid. It was a full-on strike into the heart of the cartel's operations. It could be a turning point, but it could also be the beginning of a war they weren't ready for. Micaela glanced at the townsfolk. These weren't soldiers. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and families. Yet, they were the only defense Redstone Ridge had left, and they had already proven they were willing to fight. "If you're with me, we do this together," Micaela said, her voice strong, unwavering. "I don't expect you to be perfect, but I expect you to do your best. We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for this town, for our families, for our future." One by one, the townsfolk nodded, their faces filled with resolve. Some were nervous, others unsure, but all were determined. Micaela saw it in their eyes, the same fire she had felt burning in her own chest since the cartel first set their sights on Redstone Ridge. "Then we move out at dusk," Micaela concluded. "We'll gather supplies, get in position, and hit them before they can respond." As the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, Micaela, Rayburn, and the small band of townsfolk set out toward the warehouse near the mines. They traveled light, no trucks, no vehicles that could give them away. The idea was to move in quietly and swiftly, using the cover of darkness to keep their movements undetected. Max, Luna, and Rico were with her, the K9s in top form, their senses heightened as they guided the group through the rugged terrain. The night was alive with the sounds of distant coyotes and rustling leaves, but it was the quiet tension in the air that gripped Micaela. The plan was simple: strike and get out. But things rarely went according to plan, and every step they took toward the warehouse brought more uncertainty. The group crept through the dense brush, staying low, communicating only in hand signals as they approached their target. Micaela kept her eyes on the ground, scanning the area for any signs of cartel sentries. It wouldn't be easy to get past their defenses. They would likely have lookouts stationed at key points, ensuring no one would get close without notice. They reached the outer perimeter of the warehouse, and Micaela gave a low signal for everyone to halt. Rayburn's deputies began to take positions, setting up their rifles and preparing for the assault. Micaela checked her own weapon, the weight of it familiar and steady in her hands. The K9s were silent, their bodies taut with anticipation. She could feel the tension rise in her chest as she surveyed the warehouse, its rusted exterior, the faint hum of activity from within. The cartel had clearly been operating here for some time, and their presence was deeply ingrained. But Micaela knew one thing: they had underestimated her, underestimated the people of Redstone Ridge. Without warning, she gave the signal. Rayburn's men moved in first, swiftly taking out the few guards stationed on the perimeter. The rest of the group followed, moving like shadows, slipping into the darkness of the warehouse grounds. Micaela wheeled herself toward the entrance, her dogs close behind her, their eyes fixed on the target. They were inside. The air was thick with the smell of oil, dust, and the faint scent of something more dangerous. The interior of the warehouse was a mess of crates, supplies, and equipment. Micaela quickly assessed the layout. There were stacks of crates in the far corner, likely full of whatever the cartel had been smuggling. "Go," she ordered, and Max and Luna darted toward the crates, their speed and precision unmatched as they began tearing through the supplies, looking for anything of value. Rico moved to cover the back entrance, his body taut as he kept watch for any signs of reinforcements. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. Rayburn and his team were handling the remaining cartel guards outside. But Micaela knew it wouldn't be long before the cartel realized what was happening and mounted a full-scale counterattack. "We don't have much time," Micaela muttered, watching as Max brought down a stack of crates, revealing piles of drugs and weapons hidden inside. The cartel had been running a massive operation here, using the warehouse as a distribution point for their smuggling network. Micaela knew they had to take it all, every last piece. "Take it all," Micaela shouted. "We're not leaving until it's destroyed." As they worked quickly, the ground shook with the sound of another vehicle approaching. The cartel wasn't giving up without a fight. But this time, it was too late. Redstone Ridge was no longer the target. It was the one doing the hunting. And the cartel had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated the will of the people who lived here. The moment the warehouse's explosive contents began to reveal themselves, drugs, weapons, and piles of cash, Micaela felt her heart surge with a new kind of purpose. This was it. The moment they could deliver a crippling blow to the cartel. But that sense of purpose was soon replaced by urgency, as the first sounds of reinforcements began to echo in the distance. The cartel had reacted quickly, mobilizing faster than Micaela had anticipated. She knew the clock was ticking. Destroy everything, Micaela barked, her voice low but filled with authority. She wheeled herself forward, surveying the warehouse with a tactical eye. Burn it all down if you have to. Leave nothing behind. Rayburn's deputies worked quickly, throwing everything they could carry into the flames. Smuggled guns, crates of contraband, and massive bundles of cash that would fund the cartel's violence. As flames began to lick at the sides of the warehouse, the danger became clear. If they didn't get out soon, they would be caught in the blaze and the ensuing battle with the cartel. Max, Luna, and Rico moved in unison with the humans, their sharp eyes tracking any movement in the darkened corners of the warehouse. Luna, ever the swift one, had already dispatched another cartel guard who had tried to slip inside to warn the others. Micaela couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride as she watched her dogs, knowing they were as much a part of the plan as any weapon or strategy. But time was running out. The sound of engines grew louder as the cartel's reinforcements barreled down the road, and Micaela knew they had no more time to waste. "Rayburn," she called, her voice hardening with the realization that this was the tipping point. "We have to leave. Now." Rayburn's face was grim as he emerged from the smoke-filled interior, dusting his hands off. "We're ready. The supplies are destroyed. The cartel's not getting their hands on this." As Micaela wheeled herself toward the exit, she kept her eyes locked on the growing shadows outside. The cartel had already set up a perimeter. The group had barely enough time to evacuate before the enemy arrived. But before they could move, the first gunfire rang out from behind. Micaela's instincts kicked into overdrive, and she spun around just in time to see one of the cartel's SUV doors swing open, releasing a fresh wave of heavily armed soldiers. They were fast, ruthless, and clearly had more firepower than Micaela had anticipated. The first exchange of gunfire split the air. Rayburn's deputies returned fire, their shots rang true, but the numbers were against them. The cartel's soldiers were moving fast, seeking cover and shooting to kill. There was no time for hesitation. "We need a path out," Micaela shouted over the gunfire. She swung her wheelchair into motion, pushing hard toward the back of the warehouse. Max, Luna, and Rico were already ahead, moving with deadly precision, their bodies reacting to every shot fired, anticipating their enemy's movements. Rayburn yelled from behind her, "Stay close. We're getting out of here." Micaela's heart pounded in her chest as she wheeled herself into the shadows. Her K9S had already taken down 2 more cartel men, but the firefight was intensifying. If they didn't act quickly, the cartel would take control of the whole area. They would lose everything they had fought for. Then, Micaela had an idea, a plan that could buy them precious minutes. She motioned to Rayburn, her eyes flashing with a sudden realization. "Get to the far side of the compound," she ordered. "There's a narrow path behind the crates. We can use that to cut through the back." Rayburn hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, clearly trusting her judgment. The deputies followed Micaela's lead, cutting through the smoke-filled darkness toward the narrow path. Max, Luna, and Rico were already there, circling around the perimeter as Micaela and Rayburn's group closed in. The dogs were keeping the cartel's soldiers at bay, anticipating each enemy movement with terrifying precision. With a sudden, decisive motion, Micaela pointed toward a series of barrels stacked along the path. "Set the barrels on fire. We need a diversion." One of Rayburn's men sprinted toward the barrels, striking a match and igniting them. The flames quickly shot up, creating a wall of fire between them and the advancing cartel forces. The smoke swirled, blocking the enemy's line of sight. "Go, go, go," Micaela urged, her voice cracking with urgency as she pushed herself forward. The deputies sprinted ahead, with Micaela close behind. The K9S remained at the rear, fending off the few remaining cartel members who had been brave enough to chase after them. As they cleared the warehouse grounds, The air grew thick with smoke and the sharp scent of burning debris. Micaela could hear the shouts of the cartel, but the fire had done its work. The smoke, combined with the noise of the burning wreckage, had disrupted their communications and slowed the enemy's advance. The group had made it out, but the fight was far from over. "Get to the hill," Micaela said, pointing toward the jagged terrain that led out of the compound. "We'll head toward the canyon and regroup there." They moved fast, cutting through the rough ground, making their way toward the narrow canyon that had always been a strategic escape route. Behind them, the sounds of the cartel were getting louder. More vehicles, more soldiers. But they were a step ahead, for now. Rayburn moved alongside Micaela as they made their way up the incline. He glanced at her, concern still heavy on his face. "That was too close. You really think we can keep this up?" Micaela didn't look back, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We don't have a choice. We either take them down, or they take us. And I'm not letting them take Redstone Ridge." They crested the ridge and took a moment to catch their breath, looking down at the burning warehouse below them. The sight of the flames in the distance was a bittersweet victory. They had struck a decisive blow, but the war wasn't over. "I'm sending out word," Rayburn said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "We need more people. We can't do this alone." Micaela nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I know, but we're going to need more than just people. We need to hit them harder, faster, and leave them no room to recover." And just as she spoke those words, the sound of engines in the distance made her stiffen. The cartel wasn't done. Their retaliation was about to begin. The engines in the distance grew louder, signaling the approach of more cartel reinforcements. Micaela stood firm, her eyes fixed on the winding road that led out of the compound. The sounds of tires crunching against gravel, coupled with the distant hum of vehicle engines, indicated that the cartel was not retreating but rather consolidating their forces, preparing for a counteroffensive. Micaela's strategic assessment was clear. Their initial success had been critical, but it was only the beginning of a protracted conflict. The cartel's response was to be expected. They would use every resource at their disposal to neutralize Redstone Ridge's resistance. The critical factor now was timing. Any further delay would grant the cartel the opportunity to fortify their position, recapture lost territory, and potentially escalate the violence. Micaela had anticipated a second wave, but the magnitude of the cartel's response was now evident. Rayburn, standing next to her, was already processing the new intelligence. The terrain ahead, though rugged and difficult to navigate, offered a limited advantage in terms of tactical positioning. However, the incoming cartel convoy presented a serious threat, and their precise location required immediate strategic intervention. "We need to fortify our position," Rayburn said, his voice low and resolute. "We can't afford to be caught off guard. The canyon's too narrow to defend effectively. We need to move our resources to higher ground." Micaela nodded in agreement. Higher ground provided better visibility, allowing for control over key access points, and it would force the cartel to fight from a disadvantageous position. She motioned for the group to start moving again, their path now more urgent, and their pace quickened. The group was small, but the town's resistance had already shown the cartel that the cost of occupation would be higher than anticipated. Each victory they scored, even in the face of overwhelming odds, served as a significant tactical win. However, Micaela was acutely aware that the cartel would not relent easily. Their tactical advantage lay in their numbers, their funding, and their network, which stretched far beyond the remote borders of Redstone Ridge. Rayburn's deputies took the lead, their rifles at the ready as they advanced cautiously toward the higher ground. They moved in a staggered formation, ensuring mutual cover while minimizing exposure. Meanwhile, Micaela's attention remained focused on the rear, where Max, Luna, and Rico continued to lead the charge, ensuring that their flank remained secure. The dogs were crucial assets, providing unparalleled detection and rapid response in areas where human operatives could be compromised by the terrain or enemy movements. Upon reaching an elevated ridge that overlooked the canyon, Micaela assessed the surrounding area. From this vantage point, the town could be better defended. It provided a clear line of sight for targeting and an advantageous position to launch additional strikes should the need arise. But as she surveyed the terrain, Micaela's thoughts shifted toward broader strategic objectives. The warehouse, though destroyed, had been a key asset for the cartel, and its loss would resonate throughout their operational network. The cartel's response would likely involve a more organized and tactical approach, aimed at reasserting control. "We need to make contact with neighboring communities," Micaela said, her voice deliberate. "If we can rally more towns, more militias, we stand a better chance of holding our ground." Rayburn's face tightened. The surrounding towns have been under cartel influence for years. Convincing them to fight alongside us will take more than just words. Micaela's response was firm, though her tone carried the weight of experience. "Then we make it about survival. We show them that the cartel is coming for them too. We offer them a choice, resistance or submission." As the sun began to set, Micaela's strategic mind worked furiously, formulating plans for outreach, intelligence gathering, and, if necessary, additional offensives. But despite the immediate tactical considerations, one factor remained unchanged. The cartel was not only an external threat, they were a deeply embedded force within the region's socio-political fabric. Their corruption, violence, and influence permeated local governments, businesses, and law enforcement. Breaking that hold would require more than just combat prowess. It would require dismantling their entire network. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but Micaela knew that their survival depended on their ability to adapt, innovate, and fight smarter than their adversaries. The cartel had overestimated their power, assuming that Redstone Ridge was just another forgotten town they could crush beneath their heel. Now, with each successful operation, Micaela had proven them wrong. The question, however, remained: could they maintain the momentum? Could they outlast the cartel's resources, outsmart their operatives, and rally enough support to topple an empire built on corruption and fear? The next few days would determine the fate of Redstone Ridge, and possibly the future of the region. As the group settled into position for the night, preparing for the next phase of their resistance, Micaela couldn't afford to entertain doubts. She had already seen what her people were capable of, and now they would face the true test. Nightfall settled over Redstone Ridge like a blanket, but there was no peace to be found beneath it. The stars above were obscured by the growing cloud of smoke from the warehouse fires, and the chill in the air was underscored by the tension that gripped the town. The group had found their temporary refuge atop the ridge, surrounded by the rough terrain that would give them a brief advantage, but there was no mistaking the fact that they were sitting ducks if the cartel pushed forward with their retaliation. Micaela sat in her wheelchair near the fire, her eyes scanning the ridge's edge for any signs of movement. The evening had passed without incident, but she knew that would not last. Her mind was a blur of strategy, probabilities, and risks. The time for waiting had passed. Tomorrow, they would go on the offensive again. Rayburn joined her, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. His face was drawn, weary from the day's events, but there was a quiet fire in his eyes, one that mirrored her own. They had both been through battles before, but this felt different. This was not just a fight for survival. This was a fight for everything: freedom, home, family. "We're running out of time," Micaela said quietly, her voice low but resolute. "The cartel will regroup. They'll plan their next move, and we can't afford to give them that advantage." Rayburn nodded, sitting down across from her, his rifle resting beside him. "I've been talking to some of the townsfolk," he said, his voice laced with caution. "Most of them are ready to fight, but some are still reluctant. They're scared, Micaela. They've seen what the cartel can do, and they know what will happen if we fail." Micaela's eyes locked onto Rayburn's. "I know, but they have to understand. If we don't fight now, we'll lose everything. They've already taken so much from us. We can't keep letting them walk all over us." "I get it. I really do," Rayburn replied, his jaw tightening. "But we can't fight them alone. We need reinforcements. We need allies. We need to convince the surrounding towns to join the fight." Micaela turned her gaze to the flickering flames of the fire. "That's what I'm planning to do tomorrow. We're going to rally the people of the neighboring towns. We're going to show them that the cartel isn't just coming for Redstone Ridge. They're coming for them, too." Rayburn let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "And how do we convince them? Most of them have been under the cartel's thumb for years. They're used to living in fear." Micaela's gaze hardened as she looked at him. "We show them that standing together is their only option. We remind them what we're fighting for. Our homes, our families, our way of life. We give them the choice. Fight or be controlled. Rayburn was silent for a moment, but then he nodded. All right, I'll send word out to the others. But it's going to take time. We need more than just talk. We need action. We need to hit them where it hurts. Micaela's mind raced, already calculating their next moves. She knew they couldn't wait for outside help forever. The cartel would grow stronger, and their retaliation would be swift and brutal. No, they had to hit them hard, and they had to hit them now. Tomorrow, Micaela said with a finality that brooked no argument. We move on their supply routes. We strike fast and hard. Take out their transports, their arms shipments, their money, every resource they depend on. And if they don't get the message, we take out their leaders, one by one. We cripple their command structure. Rayburn regarded her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he took in the full weight of her plan. You're not messing around. No, Micaela replied, and neither should they. The next morning, the group of resistance fighters gathered before dawn. The air was thick with purpose, every face determined but tinged with fear. Micaela knew the importance of this next move. They couldn't afford to hesitate. The only way to break the cartel's grip on the region was to take it apart piece by piece. Rayburn had gathered a few trusted deputies, while the townsfolk had formed small teams to help with logistics. They would split into groups and take on different supply routes. The plan was simple but aggressive. Strike first, strike fast, and strike hard. Micaela looked over the group before them, her gaze sweeping across the faces of those who had joined her fight. It wasn't just about defeating the cartel anymore. It was about showing them that Redstone Ridge wasn't afraid. Today, we make our stand, she said, her voice carrying across the group. We take the fight to them. We'll show the cartel that they've made a mistake. They won't control this town. They won't control us. And they won't take our homes. The townsfolk nodded, their resolve hardening. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something far stronger. Hope. Micaela had given them a reason to fight, a reason to stand tall in the face of overwhelming odds. With a sharp nod, Micaela motioned for the group to split into their respective teams. Let's move out. The day passed in a blur of movement, tension, and calculated attacks. They hit the cartel's supply trucks, ambushing them as they made their way toward Redstone Ridge. Each strike was swift, taking out the convoys before they had time to react. The sound of explosions and gunfire reverberated through the air as the resistance sent a clear message to the cartel. They were not to be underestimated. But even as the cartel's supply routes were disrupted, Micaela knew that this was only the beginning. They had made a powerful statement, but the cartel would retaliate. They would come for Redstone Ridge with everything they had. But for now, for one brief moment, Micaela allowed herself to feel a spark of hope. They had shown the cartel that Redstone Ridge was not a town to be taken lightly. As night fell and the smoke from the burning supply trucks began to dissipate, Micaela stood atop the ridge, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She could hear the distant rumble of engines, but this time, the fear was gone. She was ready. The resistance had begun, and the cartel would no longer have the upper hand. We're just getting started, Micaela muttered under her breath, a grim smile pulling at her lips. But as she turned to head back to camp, the sound of a new engine caught her ear, the unmistakable roar of a convoy approaching faster than she'd anticipated. The cartel wasn't done yet, and neither was Redstone Ridge. The convoy approached with unsettling speed, its engines roaring like thunder across the barren landscape. Micaela's pulse quickened as the familiar sound reached her ears. They had made their move, disrupting the cartel's supply routes, but now the cartel was coming to retaliate. She had anticipated it, but the reality was more intense than she had prepared for. Rayburn stood beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. They're coming in force, he muttered, his voice low but filled with grim understanding. This isn't a small push. They're bringing everything they've got. Micaela didn't need to hear more. She could already see the dust rising in the distance. The familiar rumble of cartel vehicles meant one thing. This was no longer a skirmish. This was the real fight, the one that would determine whether Redstone Ridge would survive. We need to fortify the ridge, Micaela said, her voice hard with resolve. They'll try to take us out all at once. We can't afford to be caught off guard again. Rayburn nodded and immediately began issuing commands to his deputies. Get the barricades set up. Spread out. We'll use the terrain to our advantage. Micaela's gaze didn't leave the horizon. The first of the cartel's vehicles crested the hill, its headlights cutting through the dusk like a predator's eyes. The convoy was large, at least a dozen vehicles, including heavily armed trucks and armored SUVs. The cartel was bringing in reinforcements to retake control, and they wouldn't stop until they had Redstone Ridge under their heel again. Her mind worked quickly, calculating their best chances. They had the high ground, and the ridge itself offered some protection. But they would need to act quickly. They couldn't afford to let the cartel get close to their lines. Max, Luna. Rico, she called, her voice steady despite the rising adrenaline. Stay sharp. We're going to need you to hold the line. The dog's eyes locked onto hers, their bodies tense, ready for action. Max let out a low growl. Luna's tail flicked with excitement, and Rico stood tall, his eyes scanning the terrain. Micaela had come to rely on them in ways she couldn't fully explain. They were her family, her warriors, and tonight, they would stand side by side as they always had. The first shots rang out as the cartel closed in, their soldiers firing sporadically as they tried to break through the town's defenses. Micaela and Rayburn's group had already positioned themselves behind cover, debris, rock outcroppings, and any remnants of the town's infrastructure that offered a modicum of protection. The rest of the townsfolk were doing the same, taking up positions in the shadows, their faces steely with determination. We hold them here, Micaela said, turning to Rayburn. We don't let them get past this point. We can't afford to let them push into the town. If they do, it's over. Rayburn gave her a brief nod before turning to lead his deputies into position. The sound of gunfire and shouting intensified as the cartel's first wave slammed into the town's defensive line. The resistance was small, but they had the advantage of surprise, and for now, they used it to their full advantage. Micaela stayed at the ridge, her mind calculating their next moves. The dogs were already in motion, their speed and agility making them perfect for this kind of fight. Max took the first charge, tearing into a cartel soldier with terrifying precision, his teeth sinking deep into the man's arm as he took him down to the ground. Luna and Rico flanked, quickly neutralizing two more attackers who were trying to find cover behind a broken wall. Micaela's rifle was steady in her hands, her aim true as she picked off enemy soldiers one by one, each shot ringing out with purpose. Every pull of the trigger felt like an act of defiance against the cartel's reign of terror. She had come here to protect Redstone Ridge, and no one was going to take that from her. Rayburn's voice came over the comms. They're pushing hard, Micaela. We've got to stop them before they get through. Micaela's eyes darted to the ridge line, where the cartel's second wave had begun to climb toward them, armed and desperate. Hold your ground. Do not let them through. Max, Luna, and Rico moved like shadows, darting between the gunfire, incapacitating cartel soldiers with swift, decisive movements. Max went for the largest target, a cartel enforcer who had been barking orders at his men, his presence looming over the battle. The dog leaped at him, bringing him to the ground with a roar, his teeth finding the man's throat in a single move. Luna and Rico continued to clear out the remaining soldiers, their focus unshakable, their loyalty to Micaela and the town absolute. The tide of the battle was shifting. For a moment, Micaela allowed herself to believe they might actually hold the line. The cartel had been caught off guard by the resistance's determination and strategic positioning. They were starting to retreat, but that fleeting sense of victory was short-lived. From the rear of the convoy, a new sound filled the air, a deeper, more menacing noise. The sound of an approaching helicopter. Rayburn, they've brought in air support, Micaela said urgently. We need to get everyone underground now. The helicopter's blades sliced through the air as it descended toward the ridge. It was heavily armed, equipped with mounted guns and a quick response team ready to deploy. Micaela knew that if they didn't act fast, the cartel would use the helicopter to crush their defense from above, turning the tide of the battle in their favor. Get to cover, Micaela shouted, her voice carrying through the chaos. She wheeled herself toward the base of the ridge, motioning for the others to follow. They needed to get inside the old mine shaft that had once been a source of income for the town. It was the only place that offered any real protection from the oncoming gunfire. The townsfolk scrambled to follow her lead, diving for cover as the helicopter's machine guns opened fire. The noise was deafening, the sound of bullets ricocheting off rocks and debris ringing in Micaela's ears. Max, Luna, and Rico had already retreated toward the entrance to the mine, but Micaela was still watching the unfolding chaos. She couldn't afford to be caught in the open. The helicopter's assault was relentless, the bullets tearing through the air, carving through the once peaceful landscape. Rayburn's voice came through the radio, filled with urgency. "Micaela, we need to fall back. The helicopter's too much for us to handle right now. We'll lose ground if we stay here." Micaela's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the battlefield. "No," she said firmly, gripping the wheel of her chair with both hands. "We're not falling back. We're pushing forward. Get ready to strike." And just like that, Micaela knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to let the cartel dictate the pace of this war. She wasn't going to let them control her future. She had to take the fight to them. "Right here, right now. We take down that helicopter," Micaela said, her voice cold and determined. "And we show the cartel that Redstone Ridge will never bow to them." The helicopter's whirring blades grew louder as it hovered above, its machine guns trained on the ridge. The sound of the bullets slamming into the earth sent jolts of fear through the group, but Micaela's mind was focused, locked onto one goal: taking down the cartel's aerial advantage. They had the high ground and the element of surprise on their side. They could still win this. Micaela's grip tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair, her fingers steady despite the chaos around her. "Rayburn," she called, her voice cutting through the noise of the gunfire and the low hum of the helicopter's engine. "We need to disable that helicopter. Do you have any RPGs or heavy artillery?" Rayburn's face was grim, his jaw clenched, but he understood the urgency. He motioned to one of the deputies. "Get the rocket launcher ready. We'll need a clean shot." "Not good enough," Micaela said. "We can't let them see us coming. We need to move fast, stealthy. If we launch an attack from this position, they'll see it coming." Micaela's mind raced. She could feel the heat of the moment. This was their best chance to cripple the cartel's plans and their ability to retaliate. If they didn't stop the helicopter, the cartel would gain the upper hand, and this battle would quickly become a losing fight. Her eyes scanned the ridge, her focus honed. The old mine shaft to their left was hidden from view, perfect for an ambush. The helicopter, still circling above, had no way of anticipating them from the ground. And if they timed it just right, the helicopter would be too distracted to defend itself. "Micaela," Rayburn's voice interrupted her thoughts, low and urgent. "It's risky. If they spot us, we're dead." She didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice. Move fast. Stay low. Max, Rico, Luna, stay with me." Max growled, his body coiled with energy, his ears perked. Luna and Rico followed, ready for action. The dogs were crucial to this. Together, they could cover ground quickly, flush out any remaining cartel operatives, and keep their enemies distracted while Micaela made her move. She trusted them with her life. Without another word, the group moved. The gunfire continued to tear through the air as the helicopter hovered above, its guns roaring. But Micaela's mind remained focused on her plan. The closer they got to the mine entrance, the more she could feel the heat of battle closing in around her. Every step counted now. The deputies set up their position a little further back, covering the ridge while Micaela, Rayburn, and the K9S slipped into the shadows toward the mine shaft. The air was thick with dust and the smell of gunpowder, but Micaela could see the opening of the mine ahead, just beyond a rocky outcrop. They were close. Then, the sound of the helicopter changed. It was no longer just hovering. It was moving lower, closer, its machine guns swinging left and right as it targeted the town's defensive positions. It would only take a few seconds before they would be exposed. Rayburn motioned for them to stop, crouching low. He had his rifle ready, eyes fixed on the chopper. "We need a clear shot," he whispered, his voice urgent. Micaela's eyes flashed with determination. "It's now or never," she said, and without another word, she pushed herself forward, wheeling toward the lip of the mine shaft entrance. Her K9S stayed close behind her, Max leading the way, his sharp eyes scanning the area. The helicopter's whirling blades grew louder, as if mocking their movement. It was too close, but Micaela's focus never wavered. As the helicopter swung around to face them, its gunfire intensified. In that instant, Micaela gave the order. "Take the shot." Rayburn's deputy, positioned at the ridge with the rocket launcher, fired. The missile shot through the air with a deafening whoosh, heading directly for the helicopter. Time seemed to stretch, each second agonizingly long. The missile hit the helicopter's tail rotor with a deafening explosion. The helicopter spun wildly out of control, its blades cutting through the air in erratic directions as the pilot struggled to regain control. For a brief moment, Micaela thought they might have succeeded. But then, the helicopter started to descend rapidly, crashing toward the ground with a terrifying roar. "Keep moving," Micaela shouted. The battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. With the helicopter in flames, Micaela, Rayburn, and the K9S quickly moved toward the mine shaft, ducking behind large boulders and jagged rocks for cover as gunfire erupted behind them. The remaining cartel soldiers had realized their aerial support was gone, and their focus had shifted toward the remaining resistance. Max and Luna surged ahead, their bodies moving fluidly between the gunfire, scouting ahead and flushing out any cartel soldiers who tried to press their advantage. Rico followed close behind, moving with a focused intensity that kept them all in motion. Micaela's heart pounded in her chest as they neared the mine entrance. She could hear the sounds of the cartel regrouping, organizing a counterattack, but they were already too far ahead. The mine was their refuge, their safe haven, for now. Just as they reached the entrance to the mine, a new wave of cartel soldiers emerged from the trees, armed and moving fast. Micaela and Rayburn ducked behind the stone entrance, just as Max and Luna launched themselves at the nearest group of enemies, taking them down with savage precision. Micaela's rifle was up and firing in an instant, each shot finding its mark. But they were outnumbered. The cartel's counterattack was swift, and as more vehicles screeched into view from the road, Micaela realized that their fight was far from over. Reinforcements had arrived, and this time, the cartel wasn't going to pull back. Micaela motioned for Rayburn to take cover. "We need to hold them off. Get to the other side of the ridge, and we'll make our stand there." Rayburn hesitated, but quickly nodded. "And if they follow? Then we make sure they regret it." Max, Luna, and Rico were already on the move, pushing the attackers back with ferocious speed. But the cartel had learned from their earlier mistakes. They would not underestimate Redstone Ridge again. The K9S worked as one, covering Micaela and the others as they moved through the mine. But just as Micaela thought they had gained some ground, the sound of more gunfire came from behind. A fresh wave of cartel soldiers had broken through the lines, and they were closing in fast. This was it, the final test. Micaela wasn't backing down. She gave the signal, and Rayburn's deputies opened fire, providing covering fire as Micaela wheeled herself further into the mine. The air was thick with tension, the gunfire loud enough to shake the ground beneath them. But Micaela didn't falter. She couldn't afford to. For Redstone Ridge, for her people, they were going to take the fight to the cartel, no matter what. The mine shaft was dark and narrow, and the air inside was heavy with dust and smoke. Micaela's eyes adjusted quickly, the shadows casting an eerie silence across the stone walls as she wheeled herself deeper into the cavern. The sounds of battle were muffled, but she knew the stakes were higher than ever. The cartel wasn't just fighting to maintain control, they were fighting to wipe Redstone Ridge off the map. She glanced back at Rayburn, who was covering their rear, his rifle raised and ready as he moved swiftly through the dark. His deputies had taken up defensive positions along the mine's entrance, ensuring they wouldn't be flanked. But even with their preparations, Micaela knew that the cartel wouldn't give up this easily. Max, Luna, and Rico were ahead, their eyes sharp as they moved ahead to scout. Micaela felt a flicker of pride in her chest. Those dogs had saved her life more times than she could count, and now they were doing it again. They were more than her companions. They were her lifeline, and tonight, they would play a crucial role in turning the tide. Micaela glanced at Rayburn again. "How long before they make it into the mine?" she asked, her voice quiet, measured. Rayburn's expression was grim. They'll be here in minutes. The road to the mine is narrow, and they know we're dug in. But they've got more numbers, and they won't stop until they wipe us out. Micaela nodded. They couldn't afford to wait around, not while the cartel regrouped outside. It was time to strike once more, but this time, they couldn't just play defense. They had to take the fight to the cartel, and they had to do it fast. We need to lead them into the heart of the mine, Micaela said, her voice carrying an edge of finality. Once they're in, we use the tunnels against them. It's our last advantage. Rayburn's eyes flicked to her. You think we can pull that off? We're outnumbered. We have no choice, Micaela replied. If we let them dictate the pace, we'll lose. We need to make them fight our way. No retreat. No hesitation. Rayburn gripped his rifle tighter. All right, we do it your way. Let's take the fight to them. Outside the mine, the cartel soldiers were already closing in. They had regrouped and brought in reinforcements, dozens of men with automatic weapons, moving fast and determined. They had no idea what awaited them in the dark tunnels of the mine. As the first group of cartel soldiers neared the entrance, Micaela's team set their trap. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and Micaela's heart beat faster. She motioned for Rayburn and the deputies to take their positions, signaling for the dogs to remain close. Wait for it, Micaela murmured to herself. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. The weight of her choices, the weight of the town's future, had already been placed squarely on her shoulders. There was no turning back. The first cartel soldier stepped into the darkened mouth of the mine. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, Micaela gave the order. Now! Max was the first to strike, charging forward with a roar. His powerful frame barreled into the cartel soldier, knocking him backward into the group behind him. The rest of the dogs followed suit, ripping into the cartel forces with ferocity and precision. Max took down one, Luna tackled another, and Rico moved swiftly between the attackers, disabling them with surgical accuracy. The remaining cartel soldiers scrambled, their weapons firing wildly into the dark, but Micaela and Rayburn's team had already set up barricades, making it impossible for the enemy to advance. They were trapped, just as Micaela had planned. Rayburn's voice came through her earpiece, clear and steady. They're pinned, but they're not giving up. We need to finish this, Micaela. I know, Micaela replied. She could hear the desperation in his voice. The battle was escalating faster than she anticipated. She motioned to Max and Luna, signaling them to clear the back of the tunnel. We move deeper. We don't give them a chance to regroup. Max, Luna, and Rico led the charge as the rest of the team moved deeper into the mine, keeping the pressure on the cartel soldiers, forcing them into a dead end. They moved fast, using the low ceilings and narrow passages to their advantage. Every shot was calculated, every movement precise. The noise of the battle reverberated through the tunnels, echoing off the stone walls. But Micaela's focus was absolute. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for the soul of Redstone Ridge. Then, the sound of a loud explosion rocked the mine. A cartel soldier had thrown a grenade into one of the mine's tunnels, creating a rupture in the ground. The blast sent dust and debris flying through the narrow passage, and Micaela's ears rang with the force of the explosion. Rayburn's voice crackled through the comms again, his voice tight. They're getting desperate. They know they're losing. We're not done yet, Micaela replied, her voice hard. We finished this. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, but Micaela kept the pressure up, never allowing the cartel soldiers to take control of the mine. Her K9s were relentless, clearing out any remaining cartel soldiers who attempted to regroup. Rayburn and his team were equally determined, their focus razor-sharp as they wiped out the last of the cartel forces. And then, just when Micaela thought they had won, the faint sound of more vehicles in the distance reached her ears. Another convoy was coming. Rayburn cursed under his breath. They've got reinforcements. We're not out of the woods yet. Micaela wheeled herself toward the tunnel exit, her eyes scanning the ground for the next move. They had held their ground, for now. But the cartel wasn't going to stop. Not until they had everything. We get out of here now, Micaela said firmly. We don't fight the second wave. We make sure they know we're still here, and we're not going anywhere. As they made their way toward the mine exit, Rayburn's voice was filled with both frustration and admiration. "You really think we can keep this up, Micaela?" She turned to him, her face grim, her gaze unwavering. "If we don't, Redstone Ridge falls. And I'm not letting that happen. Not now. Not ever." The town had fought too hard, bled too much, for Micaela to give up now. The cartel had no idea what they were up against. They were about to learn a hard lesson. The people of Redstone Ridge would not be cowed. They would not be silenced. And they would fight until their last breath. The earth trembled underfoot as the second wave of cartel reinforcements stormed toward Redstone Ridge. The rumbling of engines reverberated through the mine tunnels, sending a clear message. They weren't done yet. Micaela's heart raced, but her grip on the wheel of her chair never wavered. They had made it this far by striking hard, striking fast. But now, with the cartel regrouping, the fight was escalating to a whole new level. She wheeled herself toward the back of the mine, the sound of rushing footsteps behind her as Rayburn's group followed closely. The initial victory had been hard-won, but the battle for Redstone Ridge was far from over. The cartel had underestimated them before. Now, Micaela was determined to make sure they never made that mistake again. "Rayburn, what's our status?" Micaela called, her voice sharp as she scanned the tunnels for signs of the advancing cartel forces. "We've cleared the first wave," Rayburn replied, his tone grim. "But there's a lot more coming. We can't afford to let them push us back." Micaela's eyes locked on the mine's exit. They needed to create a stronghold here, in the belly of the town's historic past. If they could keep the cartel from making it through the mine, they might just stand a chance of survival. "Get everyone to the ridge," Micaela ordered, her voice filled with authority. "We use the high ground. We'll have a clear line of sight and more control over the terrain. The K9s and I will clear the path. No one gets left behind." Max, Luna, and Rico moved to the front, already sniffing the air, alert to the cartel forces drawing near. Micaela didn't need to give them any further commands. They knew their roles better than anyone. The dogs had become her eyes and ears, moving silently through the shadows as they picked off enemies one by one, keeping them distracted long enough for the townsfolk and Rayburn's team to regroup. Rayburn nodded, signaling to his men to move forward. "Let's go. We have one shot at this." As the group made their way to the ridge, the sound of the approaching convoy grew louder. Micaela's mind was racing. She knew the cartel would do anything to take back control of Redstone Ridge, and they weren't about to back down. But neither was she. If there was one thing she'd learned about the cartel, it was this. They thrived on intimidation. They thought they could scare the people of this town into submission. But the people of Redstone Ridge had a different idea. When they reached the ridge, the battle intensified. Micaela and Rayburn took up positions behind natural rock outcroppings, their eyes fixed on the open expanse below. The town, still partially intact, was in the distance, the smoke from the fire rising high into the sky. The ridge provided a perfect vantage point. Rayburn's voice was tight with urgency. "They'll be here any minute. Are you ready for this?" Micaela gave him a hard, steady look. "We've been ready for this from the moment they first set foot in Redstone Ridge." Her K9s fanned out across the rocky terrain, moving in calculated patterns as they prepared to engage. Max was already out of sight, his massive frame blending with the landscape, while Luna and Rico stayed close to Micaela's side, ready to act on her command. The first of the cartel vehicles appeared over the ridge, a black SUV, followed by a heavily armored truck. The cartel had come in full force, and they were making no attempt to hide it. The sound of their engines filled the air, and the unmistakable glint of weapons flashed in the distance. Micaela motioned to Rayburn. "Get your men ready. We'll take them by surprise. We need to hit them before they can spread out." Rayburn nodded, his rifle aimed steadily at the approaching vehicles. "On your command, Micaela." The cartel convoy continued its approach, unaware of the trap that lay in wait for them. As they drew closer, Micaela's heart raced, but she held steady. This was it, the moment when everything they had fought for came to a head. "Now!" Micaela shouted. With a single word, the battle exploded into action. Max leaped forward, his jaws sinking into the first cartel soldier he encountered, knocking him to the ground with a thunderous crash. Luna and Rico followed suit, tearing through the ranks with terrifying efficiency. The townsfolk and Rayburn's deputies opened fire from their positions, pinning the cartel down with precision and force. The cartel's soldiers were scattered, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the resistance. But they quickly recovered, scrambling to regroup. The armored truck, however, was their greatest threat, and it was moving fast, its guns firing as it tried to advance. "Max, take the truck," Micaela shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Max responded immediately, charging at the vehicle with all his might. The armored truck's gunfire intensified, but Max was relentless, his powerful body slamming into the front bumper, forcing the truck to veer off course. Luna and Rico tore through the back, distracting the soldiers inside and neutralizing them before they had a chance to fight back. Micaela's rifle was steady in her hands as she fired at the soldiers still attempting to regroup, picking them off one by one. Rayburn and his team were in constant motion, shifting positions, using the terrain to outflank the cartel's forces. The sound of the gunfire, the growls of the K9s, and the shouts of the cartel soldiers echoed through the canyon. Micaela could feel the heat of the battle intensifying, but she wasn't about to back down now. They had come too far, fought too hard. "We've got them on the run," Rayburn yelled, his voice filled with determination. But Micaela knew better. This wasn't over. Not yet. Suddenly, a loud, rumbling sound echoed through the ridge. A new wave of cartel reinforcements was coming, and they were closing in fast. Micaela's heart sank. She knew they couldn't hold this position for much longer. The cartel had more resources, more men. But she also knew that if they could hold their ground just a little longer, they might be able to tip the scales in their favor. "Rayburn," Micaela shouted, "we need to fall back. Head for the town. We'll make our last stand there." Rayburn's face was filled with urgency, but he didn't hesitate. "Understood. We move now." Max, Luna, and Rico quickly regrouped, returning to Micaela's side as the group started to retreat. But the cartel's reinforcements were nearly upon them. "We don't have much time," Micaela said, her voice fierce. "We make our stand in the town, and we make it count." The battle for Redstone Ridge had reached its peak. The cartel might be closing in, but Micaela knew one thing. The fight wasn't over until they said it was, and Redstone Ridge wasn't going down without a fight. The retreat was swift but calculated, every step taken with purpose. Micaela's mind was sharp, but even she couldn't ignore the growing weight in the air. The overwhelming sound of approaching cartel reinforcements. Their numbers were vast, and their determination to crush Redstone Ridge's resistance had grown even more desperate. But despite the odds, Micaela had a singular focus: the town and the people who still believed they could fight back. The town of Redstone Ridge had been their sanctuary, their home. Now, it was going to be their battlefield. "Move, move, move," Rayburn barked, leading the group back toward the town. The sounds of heavy gunfire and the rhythmic pounding of cartel vehicles grew louder, but the resistance held firm. The mine had been their temporary stronghold, but now it was time to fall back to a more defensible position. Micaela pushed her wheelchair with grim determination, the K9s by her side, and Rayburn's team moving swiftly to cover the retreat. The cartel's forces had regrouped, but they had no idea how the town was preparing to face them head-on. As they reached the outskirts of the town, Micaela could see the fires still burning from the warehouse raid. The night air was thick with smoke, but that only hardened her resolve. Every ounce of fear that had once threatened to take hold of her had burned away in the crucible of battle. Now, all that was left was a fire to protect her home and the people she loved. "We're almost there," Micaela shouted to her team, her voice strong as ever. "Get the barricades set up. Prepare for a final push." Rayburn was already ahead, coordinating the positions with his deputies. They knew the cartels would attack with everything they had, and they wouldn't stop until they were sure Redstone Ridge was under their control. But Micaela had one more surprise for them. She wheeled herself to the front of the line, her eyes scanning the town's narrow streets. This was where it would all come down, the heart of Redstone Ridge. If they couldn't hold this ground, the entire town would be lost. But Micaela wasn't about to let that happen. "We're not just defending our town," she said, her voice steady and filled with resolve. "We're making sure the cartel knows they've made a mistake. No one messes with Redstone Ridge. Not while we're still breathing. Rayburn's deputies moved quickly, reinforcing the barricades with any scrap they could find. The townspeople, once so terrified of the cartel's reach, now stood tall, their faces filled with a grim determination. They were ready to die for this town. "Everyone get in position," Rayburn called out, his voice carrying over the din of approaching vehicles. "We hold this line, no matter what. They want to take this town. They're going to have to pry it from our cold, dead hands." Micaela looked at him, her eyes blazing with the same fire that had fueled her from the beginning. "That's the spirit. Now, let's show them what Redstone Ridge is made of." The first of the cartel's vehicles came into view, a convoy of armored trucks, followed by SUVs filled with heavily armed men. The sound of their engines shook the ground beneath them, but Micaela didn't flinch. She knew what she had to do. Rayburn's team took up positions along the barricades, while Micaela, with Max, Luna, and Rico by her side, moved to the front line. The dogs were poised for action, their bodies tense, eyes sharp. They had been through countless battles, and now was no different. They were ready. Micaela's rifle was steady in her hands. She could feel the weight of the weapon, but she knew the real weapon was her will. The cartel had underestimated Redstone Ridge at every turn, and now they would learn that the people of this town were willing to fight back, no matter the cost. "They're coming fast," Rayburn muttered, his eyes scanning the convoy. "We need to hit them before they reach the barricades." "I'll take care of the front," Micaela said, her voice unwavering. "You focus on the reinforcements." Max, Luna, and Rico sprang into action, darting forward with lightning speed, taking down the first few cartel soldiers who dared to step out of their vehicles. Micaela's heart raced as she fired shot after shot, each one finding its mark, but she knew it wasn't enough. They needed to push forward, be relentless. The cartel soldiers scrambled for cover, but the resistance was already in motion. Rayburn's deputies opened fire, holding their ground as the remaining cartel forces tried to regroup. It was chaos, the town becoming a war zone as explosions and gunfire filled the air. Micaela moved quickly, making her way closer to the front. She could hear the sound of the dogs tearing into the cartel's ranks, their growls echoing in the night. Max had already brought down another cartel soldier, Luna and Rico close behind. They were unstoppable, their training and loyalty a force that no cartel soldier could match. Rayburn and his team had begun setting up makeshift traps along the town streets, forcing the cartel's vehicles to slow down. But the real test was still ahead. The cartel wasn't going to stop just because they'd lost a few soldiers. They were angry now, and that made them dangerous. As the next wave of cartel soldiers rushed toward the barricades, Micaela could feel her pulse quicken. She aimed her rifle and took out another soldier, but the enemies were closing in, their weapons trained on the resistance. She could see the armored trucks pushing through the debris, relentless in their assault. "Fall back," Rayburn shouted, his voice hoarse. "We need to get to higher ground. Move." Micaela's heart sank, but she knew the plan had to change. They couldn't afford to stay exposed. They had to make the cartel fight for every inch of ground. They would take back this town, or die trying. "Max, Luna, Rico," Micaela shouted. "Stay close. Keep them off us." Her loyal dogs leaped forward, taking down more cartel soldiers, but even they couldn't keep the forces at bay forever. Micaela felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She knew that if the cartel breached the barricades, Redstone Ridge would fall. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not ever. The fight for Redstone Ridge had come to its most critical moment. This was the reckoning, and it was up to Micaela and the people of the town to show the cartel that no matter how powerful they were, they would never control the heart of this land. With her K9S at her side and the townsfolk standing together, Micaela prepared for the final push. She wasn't fighting just for her survival anymore. She was fighting for the future of Redstone Ridge, and she would never back down. The dust of battle hung heavy in the air, settling over the town like a veil. Micaela's heart pounded in her chest, but her grip on her rifle never faltered. The final moments had arrived. This was the moment that would define the future of Redstone Ridge. She could hear the sound of engines roaring in the distance, the unmistakable growl of the cartel's reinforcements moving in. The streets were a war zone, littered with debris. The occasional body of a cartel soldier or a fallen townsfolk, reminders of the price they had all paid for this fight. The barricades they'd set up had been battered, but they hadn't fallen, and neither had Micaela or the people of Redstone Ridge. Max, Luna, and Rico moved through the smoke and rubble, their bodies drenched in blood but their eyes sharp and focused. They were more than just dogs. They were warriors, and each of them had brought down dozens of cartel soldiers in the relentless struggle that had raged through the town. Micaela was sure they had turned the tide more times than she could count. She wheeled herself into the center of the street, where Rayburn and the remaining deputies had gathered. The town was positioned at the high ground, but the cartel was now pushing forward, their armored trucks and SUVs closing in like a storm. There was no more time for subtlety. The cartel had underestimated them for far too long, and now they were going to pay. "Rayburn," Micaela called, her voice steady despite the storm of violence around them. "How much longer until the last group gets here?" Rayburn gritted his teeth. "We're holding the line, but not for much longer. They've pushed us back, and we're getting too spread out. They've got heavy artillery on the way." Micaela's mind worked quickly. She had one last move to make, a move that could either end this fight or break them all. "Everyone to the center," she ordered, raising her voice over the gunfire. "We hold the square. We push them back into the streets, and we keep pushing until they break." Rayburn and his men quickly moved into position, setting up their final defense. The townsfolk, who had fought tooth and nail to protect their homes, were now ready for the final stand. Micaela's eyes scanned the battlefield, her mind racing. She knew the cartel was getting desperate. They weren't just coming for the town. They were coming for her. She looked down at Max, who was by her side. His ears perked as he watched her. Luna and Rico stayed close behind. The dogs were never far from her side, always alert. She gave them a nod, a silent command. "Let's finish this," she whispered. The cartel's vehicles rumbled closer, but the resistance was already in motion. Max led the charge, his body a blur of muscle and strength as he lunged at the nearest cartel soldier, bringing him to the ground in an explosion of fur and fury. Luna and Rico followed, taking out the men trying to flank them. The sound of gunfire echoed through the air as Micaela opened fire, taking down 2 more cartel soldiers before they had time to react. Rayburn and his team moved with precision, picking off enemies from higher ground, forcing the cartel soldiers to retreat. The armored trucks were closing in, but the resistance had positioned themselves perfectly, forcing the cartel to fight in the open. They were no longer the ones controlling the battle. It was Redstone Ridge now. Micaela felt the tide turning, but she didn't let her guard down. The final push was coming. The cartel's armored truck was nearly on top of them, its machine guns firing relentlessly. Micaela saw the danger. It was headed straight for their position, and they needed to take it down before it breached their lines. "Rayburn, get to the truck," Micaela shouted. Rayburn didn't hesitate. On it. He and his team moved quickly, setting up an ambush point on the other side of the street. Micaela wheeled herself forward, positioning herself just out of sight, her rifle trained on the truck. Max, Luna, and Rico moved into the shadows, waiting for the signal. As the truck drew closer, Micaela's heart raced. She could see the cartel soldiers inside, their faces filled with anger and desperation. They thought they had it won. They thought they had the upper hand, but they didn't know what they were up against. "Now!" Micaela shouted. Rayburn's team opened fire, hitting the truck's tires and engine, forcing it to skid and lose control. The truck veered off course and crashed into a nearby building, bursting into flames. The cartel soldiers inside screamed, but it was too late. The explosion was deafening, sending shockwaves through the street. The cartel's forces faltered, their momentum broken. In that instant, the resistance moved in, a surge of anger and defiance that pushed the cartel back. They had seen their might fall in flames, and now there was nothing left but to fight for survival. Micaela's K9S moved through the carnage, taking down the remaining cartel soldiers who tried to flee. The remaining cartel vehicles were caught in a crossfire, unable to break through the resistance's line. One by one, they fell, their wheels disabled, their soldiers captured or neutralized. The sounds of the battle slowly began to quiet, the echoes of the war zone giving way to a haunting silence. Micaela wheeled herself forward, her eyes scanning the remnants of the battle. The fires still burned, the smoke rising into the air, but Redstone Ridge had won. Rayburn walked over to her, a look of disbelief on his face. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of exhaustion and awe. "We actually did it." Micaela looked around at the people who had stood by her side, who had fought, bled, and died for this town. The townsfolk, the deputies, her K9s, together, they had stopped the cartel. They had reclaimed Redstone Ridge. "We did," Micaela said softly, her voice steady. "But it's not just us. It's the people of this town. They fought for this." She wheeled herself toward the center of the square, the crowd beginning to gather. The people who had once feared the cartel now stood tall, their faces filled with pride. They had faced the darkest of odds and emerged victorious. But Micaela knew this wasn't the end. The cartel would never fully be gone. They would regroup, and they would come back. But Redstone Ridge had proven that it could stand strong, that it could fight and win. "We're not done yet," Micaela said, her voice carrying across the town. "We've taken back Redstone Ridge, but we still have a fight ahead of us. But now, we know what we're fighting for." The people cheered, their voices rising in unison. The battle for Redstone Ridge was over, and Micaela Castillo had shown them all that no force, no matter how powerful, could take this town without a fight. And together, they would stand. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.